Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Hi, I recently had a conversation with Russell Newquist. At the time, it was before his book War Demons came out. When I'm recording this, the actual release date of War Demons is today. It's Russell's first novel in a series of novels. And the conversation started there and very quickly branched into other, sometimes related things. It was quite long, but I had a great time, and I hope you enjoy. So here it is. So you've got a novel that you're publishing soon that you've actually written coming out, called Now War Demons. And so, where does this take place relative to the short story that you had published not too long ago with the same character?
Well, the main character of the novel is actually not quite the same character. Peter Bishop, the character I've done before, is the secondary character. He's almost, but not quite, a co-protagonist in the story. The main character is a different guy. I would actually classify it as Peter's origin story. It didn't start out that way. It started out being about this other character who, was interesting to me. And I got to a certain point in the story and I realized with what was going on, it's just like, wow, this is Peter's origin story. I had no idea he was even going to be in this book. and it kind of elevated him to a, like I said, almost to a co-protagonist status. Not quite, because it's not really his book. But in a certain way, that almost made the origin story more interesting. I was talking about this with Declan Finn the other night. The one thing about origin stories is that after a while, they all start to kind of become the same. They really, get that. I just watched, for instance, I watched the Doctor Strange movie with my kids last night. My wife and I had seen that before, but the kids hadn't. So we watched it. I came home early because it was my birthday. We sat down and watched the movie. And, one of the complaints people make about that film, even though I really enjoy the film for some other reasons, but one of the complaints people make is, wow, it's another Marvel origin film. And specifically, if you really think about it, it's basically the plot of the first Iron Man movie all over again. Almost the same character in a lot of ways. You have a rich, very arrogant, very capable, very intelligent man, but he's also a bit of an asshole. And and then he progresses to being first a kind of decent human being and then a hero by the end of the film. But forgetting those two films, which are extremely similar, you do have a very similar plot arc when you just tell origin stories over and over. By having that be kind of the B plot of the book instead of the main plot, it really avoided that in a lot of ways. It's because it's not really Peter's story. It's really the story of another character named Michael. And so that was interesting. So that kind of answers your question as well as to where it fits in. It's his origin story. So it's a bit of a prequel to the other stories.
That puts the Peter Bishop in an interesting light, since in the short story, he also was not the main character. And so it's kind of curious. I don't know to what degree it's going to be a theme that he'll never be a main character in his own books.
It's not. I have two short stories out with the character now, actually. The second story, he is the main character. So that's, already been broken.
What's that called, by the way? Because I read Who's Afraid of the Dark, but
It's Night of the Changeling, Night with a K. A bit of a pun in there with the changeling. You'd probably enjoy it. The story begins with a baptism that goes horribly wrong, and continues from there. Continues into fairyland, actually, this time, and goes through. But there is a similarity between those two stories. Who's Afraid of the Dark did not begin as a Peter Bishop story either. It started off the other part of the story, and it got to a certain point. And it was like, well, I have to resolve this somehow, because the main character of that story is a 5-year-old boy who is a very, very brave and capable 5-year-old boy. But at the end of the day, he's still a 5-year-old boy, and he's not really able to deal with the problems on his own. So I needed another character to deal with that. And then it was like, oh, duh, I have this character I've been wanting to write. Here we go. We put it in and it all works. So So yeah, it kind of started because I had the Peter Bishop character is one I've wanted to write for a long time. I've had him in my head, and I had these other projects, and the book right now was kind of well, I got to a certain point in the book, and at first I was like, I don't really know where I'm going with this book, but if I don't finish it, I'll never finish a book, any book. It's like if I stop this to go to another project, that's what I'm going to do forever. So I got to a certain point. It's like, okay, I'm going to finish this one. I'm glad I did, because it actually turned into a book that I quite like. And the readers who have gotten it so far have given me really raving feedback. I've gotten a lot of people are coming back with, wow, this is really good. We enjoy it. So I'm glad I did go ahead and finish it, especially because I did figure out, I wanted to finish that book so I could write Peter. And then it turned out to be a Peter book, so it worked out very, very well at the end. And as far as him going on into his own books, my current plan is this book is the first of a trilogy that is centered around Michael. I had planned to I'm going to be doing a separate book series about Peter, and I had planned to interleave and to go back and forth from one to the other. Until this trilogy is done, and then continue that series onward. But what I have decided to do for business reasons is I'm going to go ahead and finish up this series first and get it done, and then go into the other series separately from that. So the stories will still interleave. The first two books of the other series are going to take place between the three books of this trilogy.
Oh, that's an interesting challenge to pull off.
It is
not giving spoilers, but
one of the approaches is that I've already got solid outlines most of the way done for both the next book in this series and the first book in Peter's series. So by having the outline, my plan is to have the outlines of those first two books done before I write the books that follow them in this series, so that I at least have a general idea of what's happened and can make them match up.
Actually, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, that's good.
Oh, I was thinking actually of once you pick, if you do book, like if we call them 1, 2, and 3 and A, B, and C, they're supposed to be, A1, B2, etc. That if you're doing A and B, which is supposed to have one in between it, but you haven't written one yet, it's just an interesting challenge that B will have to tell you some of the things that happened, so that you're not missing the context, but on the other hand, not be spoilers of what happened. So that's the part that I meant is the interesting challenge.
It is enough without. It's something that I've thought about. Well, one of the things that works in this case is because they have diverging but interlinked stories. So it will not be necessary at all to have read the intermediate books in either series in order to follow the books you're reading. Obviously, you'll get a more complete story if you do that, and they'll tie together in ways that I think will be very satisfying to readers when it's done. But but you won't have to have done that. So it'll be pretty easy to not give spoilers, I think, because they just won't rely on each other, and it'll be more of a case of, we'll throw in some references to events that happened in there, but we can make them vague enough to. The thing about that is, actually, as a writer, that almost makes it more interesting, because you can throw out some references that work in the story, but then you don't provide the details. And that makes it in some ways more interesting to the reader, because they are like, oh, well, that sounds really neat. What happened? Which also works from a business perspective, because then they want to go buy the other books to find out what happened.
That's certainly true. And at the same time too, as a reader, it's always satisfying when there are things that are not in fact loose ends. They just they get tied up somewhere else, as opposed to truly loose ends, which actually is not a bad introduction to the main thing I want to talk about tonight, which is the relationship of plot holes to universes, and something you had mentioned in a conversation you had with Brian Niemeyer on his channel about how War Demons is in that older tradition that is it's not in your face about being in a Christian universe. It's not, it's not trying to sell you on anything or convince you of anything, but it does take that for granted as the universe that it's in. And it seems to me that one real benefit to doing that, using that sort of setting, is that you have an actual coherent background that is intellectually coherent and works out, so you don't have any huge gaping plot holes lurking around corners that you might accidentally sort of just stumble into, which is something that I see all over the place in lots of modern fiction, where they're just giant gaping plot holes that the author seems to not have considered. So I'm very interested in your take on that. What's the benefit of having a coherent universe that other people have worked out for you beforehand.
Well, I absolutely agree with that. I agree with it 100%, and it's one of the reasons I chose this approach. But part of the reason I chose it is because I'm Catholic, and so it's a worldview that actually fits with what I believe. So that was nice and that was helpful, but that's not actually the main reason that I chose it. The main reason I chose it is for what you say specifically. It helps from a storytelling perspective. And one of the greatest examples, I think, of exactly what you're saying is the "our vampires are different" trope, which is huge in modern, any kind of modern urban fantasy or anything that encroaches on it. I'm going to talk about one that really springs to mind for me. But
what is that trope? Just to be clear, both for my sake and for
sure,
that trope specifically is.
Well, it's the case of, okay, we're going to talk about vampires, but our version of vampires is going to be slightly different from the major trend, and we're going to have some variation on it. The most extreme example that would make everybody laugh is probably sparkly vampires that we're all familiar with. But some other examples that you'll see, and this actually gets into the example I was going to talk about in a minute of one of these, is actually a show that I really love. It's one of the shows that really kicked off the current urban fantasy trend on TV, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The show's a blast. It's a load of fun. But if you stop to think about their vampire lore at all, it doesn't make any sense at all. I
only caught a few episodes of it. Did it make like less and less sense?
Yes,
as seasons wore on.
It did, and that's part of the trope as well, or part of the problem as well. And I'll get into that in a second as it goes on. So the series begins with vampires that are basically kind of somewhat normal vampires, except so one of the catches is there's the character Angel, who of course later went on to have his own show, which was also a great show, but in some ways is actually a better show in my opinion. But they have him right there at the beginning of the series. He shows up, and the thing is well, he's a vampire who has a soul. Now, right there, that one thing already introduces a lot of problems that you have to think through. Because a classic vampire from the Dracula lore onward is what? He's somebody who sold his soul. He never had no soul to begin with. He's a human being who sold his soul and has gone dark. He still has a soul, in there. So by starting off the show by saying, well, this vampire has a soul, you're already setting up yourself for a lot of. Now you have to create a coherent system wherein that makes sense. And what the show kind of settles on later is that their version is that a vampire is a person like you and me who has been more or less possessed by a demon that turns them into a vampire. And that's basically kind of what they settle on into the first and second season. But then they go onward with the show, and they continue to have more and more problems with the lore. And like you said, it makes less and less sense as you go on. So one of the things is, and there's a little bit of inconsistency in the show. Like in the beginning, they start off with, well, there's this one guy who is a vampire who was given his soul back as a curse, which is kind of funny in and of itself. So he was cursed to have his soul back so that he would remember all the horrible things he'd done as a vampire and feel guilty over it, because he has a soul now. But that in and of itself raises a problem. And it raises a huge moral and ethical and theological problem if you think about it. If he's possessed by a demon, and he's doing these things because he's possessed by a demon, does he have any guilt for this at all? And the logical answer to that is no. If he doesn't have any control over himself while he's doing this, if it's a demon that's doing it, he doesn't really have any guilt.
Yeah.
In any meaningful sense.
It gets complicated by whether, you can bifurcate on whether or not there's any cooperation with the demon.
Right.
Because possession very often has some sort of element of cooperation involved.
Right. And that would be a way to go. That's not the way the show went, really, at all.
I wouldn't think so, especially because, one of the problems is being modern. It's incredibly limiting because, modern people generally haven't studied any philosophy. And so I suspect a great many modern people, has a soul in their case doesn't actually refer to anything having to do really with souls, but it's more like is nice.
And the show kind of takes it that direction. That's, it's the very modern approach to that is, he has a soul, so now he's kind of a good person and automatically feels bad for all this. Well, that's another problem with this world model is you and I, Chris, know plenty of people who have souls and do terrible things and don't really feel remorse for it at all. So just having a soul in and of itself doesn't make you a good person.
No, in fact, a soul's required in order to be immoral.
Right.
A rock that is used to smash the skulls of 10,000 innocent people is not an immoral rock.
And yes, that's exactly the point I was trying to make, is if he's possessed by a demon and the demon is doing these things, he's a rock. He's a rock who is being used by a demon to do these horrible things. So he's not really in control of any of it. Now, if you'd approached the story from, well, he still feels guilty because he remembers it all but couldn't control it, then okay, that makes a kind of sense.
Although, shouldn't it be more like the sort of, essentially post-traumatic stress of very analogous to what soldiers in war who see lots of death, experience.
Right.
That's, it shouldn't be much more like that sort of trauma because he's just he's at that point just a witness to lots of innocent people being killed.
And it's a human thing to feel guilt for that anyway, right? So you have a thing there where you could approach the story that way and it makes sense. But
of course they one of the strangest tropes in so much of science fiction and fantasy is mind control.
Right.
But not body control, mind control, where somehow your will is controlled such that you then choose to do the things you're being made to do, and which has that just incredible and unresolvable contradiction right at the very core of it, that either you are choosing it or you're not choosing it. You can't be forced to choose it.
Right. Yeah, and it's this particular example is also very emblematic of what I kind of refer to myself as Joss Whedon syndrome, which is a lot of his stuff. I'm a big fan, actually, of the guy. I have a lot of his work, but a lot of his stuff really falls apart when you stop to think about it. The first Avengers film is another great example, which is, I'm only going to stay there for a second because we're veering off topic, but the film, if you stop to think about it, when you leave the theater and you start to pick it apart, the film makes no sense. The entire plot of the film makes no sense.
The character pointed out how dumb the plot was.
Right, he did.
With style.
But here's the thing about Joss Whedon, and this is the reason why he made $1 billion film. You're having so much fun watching the movie that you don't care until the credits roll. And that's why he gets away with it, because I will say that movie is a blast, and I will still watch it again. And I know all of the plot holes while I'm watching it because I've had years to think about it now. I know all of them, and I still watch it and enjoy it because it's that much fun. And it's that's less of a religion thing and more of a this particular producer and author who has this issue.
Well, it's an interesting. I mean, it does bring up the curious point that there are different virtues that a story can have, and it is possible to essentially, use a tremendous amount of virtue in the natural sense of virtue, like a natural virtue of, the ability to be entertaining in the moment, to sort of distract from the bigger problems within the thing. Serenity also had that, where his reavers made not even the tiniest bit of sense, because it's
Right.
A bunch of homicidal maniacs who for some reason are able to cooperate in a functional society.
Right. And if you judge a story primarily on how entertaining it is, he's a huge success, and monetarily he's a huge success. And personally, I do think that's the best criterion to judge a story from. Are you entertained by it? If you're entertained by it, then it's served its purpose, primary purpose as a story. And he pulls that off in spades. But at a deeper level, there's a level where it completely fails because, again, getting back to the topic at hand, the world around it makes no sense. It's not just the plot of the film, the world around it. And the lore in Buffy, again, continues to get worse and worse, and the vampires continue to just make less and less sense as both series go on. There's another character, and again, think this through in the framework we've already discussed. There's another character who's a major antagonist for several seasons of the show. I can't remember how many, but 3 or 4 seasons, maybe 5, he's a major antagonist, the character Spike, the vampire. And all of a sudden, this character, who has no soul, decides that he's in love with Buffy, the main character, so he goes off on a quest to get a soul. And I see the face you're making. And
there's got to be some angle from which that makes any sense whatsoever.
No, there's really not. It doesn't make any sense. And now, granted, this is towards season 5 or 6 of the show, when the show was really on a pretty downward trajectory already at this point. The first 3 seasons were great. Season 4 was okay. Season 5 was starting to get weird, and then it went off the rails, which is why it got canceled.
Wasn't there the what is it called, the sorting algorithm of evil? And you're familiar with that trope, right? That you have to always put there's the evil people are carefully sorted, and then you always fight the smaller baddies and work your way up. There's never any discontinuity.
I hadn't heard that. I do know that in most writing classes, they will specifically tell you to write it that way. And that ties in amusingly enough to the discussion we had on our own podcast this weekend. You're right that makes no sense. It's absolutely ridiculous, and yet it's a story trope that we, as either culturally or programmed into us, we expect.
It serves certain functions. I mean, it's not as necessary as a lot of people make out. I mean, a lot of things that are common aren't. Because the thing is, you can justify the sorting algorithm of evil in certain ways that actually do make sense. One of the big ones being that you can have, as the hero is working his way up, the reason why he isn't squashed, if you introduce some other antagonist to the main villain, who is much, at least in appearance or often in effect much larger, it then makes sense that primary resources would be devoted to someone else, and you're left in relative obscurity to work your way up until you become a big enough threat. And then you get the bonus, you can then have alliances too, so that it makes a certain, part of the way you win is not just one guy managed to become so incredibly powerful he can take down an empire, but rather than you can form alliances, and then you can get the synergistic working to have the effect, and so on. So you can justify it and make it work that sort of way, such that why the hero is able to have the hero's quest where he progresses. Another option, by the way, is we're just also used to role playing games that everyone has to level up, and we know that. Um, but the thing about the sorting algorithm of evil is that if you don't have a very, very coherent world, it tends to just, every time you go up a level, it tends to just knock your world apart all the more
Yes.
because the next level up is not consistent with anything you've done before.
Well, and I think you've hit the nail on the head inadvertently for what the real problem is with all this, which is that it's not so much that somebody has a view that's non-Christian, although I can get back to that in ways for specifically vampire lore and a lot of our folklore that we use. Non-Christian does actually present problems because those are Christian folklore. But the problem isn't that they have a non-Christian worldview. The problem is that they don't have a coherent worldview. So in a lot of these cases, what you really have is you have somebody started with hey, this sounds cool and it works for our episode 1. Oh, well, we can work it like this to make a season out of it. We'll figure out next season in a year. Well, let's just make it work. And then you get to season 2 and you're like, oh man, we did this. What are we going to do? Oh, hey, let's add this on top of it. And okay, that works pretty well. And then you get to season 3 and you're like, oh man, we've kind of written ourselves into a corner. What are we going to do now? Well, let's add this. Wait, that doesn't make any sense with what we did over. It's okay, the viewers will forget. And then you get into retconning, and you get into all things go on. But the reality is what they're really ultimately relying on is for you to be having enough fun that you've forgotten what you saw 2 seasons ago, and they'll tell you a new version of it that makes sense with what they're telling you today, and it'll work until next season when we change the big bad again and we need a new framework that works, and we keep going.
I think, by the way, that sort of thing, I mean, personal weakness, I'm a rereader. In general, I don't consider something that I read, with exceptions, to be a good use of time unless I'm probably going to reread it a few times. Just by personality, like that's the approach I tend to take to literature. I mean, I'm just finishing rereading Pride and Prejudice for the 21st time, something like that. It works because I already know it so well that the fact that I can read half a page at a time before some child needs me doesn't actually ruin my enjoyment of it. But anyway, the thing is, books are very different, I think, than, I mean, not completely different. There's light entertainment and so on, even in novels. But television shows, and especially, I mean, TV is changing, but especially in the days of broadcast television, something you said was, I think, very key in that in broadcast television, what we did in season 1 was literally 2 years ago.
Right.
And a lot of people will have forgotten what happened 2 years ago, and stuff they saw once per week may have missed a few episodes anyway. Novels are, I think, very different in that, like, when people recommend, a person will finish a novel, or at least most of it, before recommending it to somebody. And I think, especially even, in ones where they're series, it's, I think, fairly common, looking at my own experience, although I'm atypical, so I admit that you'll read through, you'll be hungry for the next one. You'll go and read that one, and you'll go through several before you start really recommending them to friends. And then you get a real sense of the whole thing as it gets put together. And so I think when it comes to written fiction, because readers themselves are a little bit atypical these days, that fiction, written fiction is consumed very differently than television fiction, especially broadcast television.
Yes and no. I will agree with you in part. One thing to keep in mind is that the way people consume written fiction and the way people consume television both are changing. I've had several conversations with some other authors about this recently. Up until very recently, and the real explosion of indie publishing and self-publishing in the last decade or so, in the traditional publishing world, there was a limit, basically, of how quickly books could come out from any given author. And those are driven by various forces that we could have an entire conversation about on our own, about what caused it and why. But the short version is that a book in the same series by the same author was more or less limited by production ability and business reasons to about once a year. And it was rare to see more than one book a year by the same author come out, period. There are some authors who managed to pull it off for various reasons, mostly because they're starting to get contracts with multiple publishers is how they're able to do it, and genre hopping and doing things. But for the most part, you're seeing a given series is limited to about one book a year. The short version is because the way the traditional publishing world works, the day you turn in your manuscript, about the fastest they can possibly get your book out is about 6 months after they receive the manuscript. It's the way their business process works. So when you have a series that's largely done, which typically is when they start to get popular, is when you have lots of books in a series out already. But when you have a series that's already done, yes, people would absolutely read it the way you're talking about. But then if it's an ongoing series that's not finished yet, once they've read all the books that are out there, they're back stuck like everybody else, where they're reading one book a year as they come out. So there was a large degree in the written world as well. And I've read several book series that are the same, that start off really interesting, and you get to the midpoint in the series somewhere and you're like, this doesn't make sense anymore. This isn't consistent with what we've been doing up to this point. I would also agree with you that by and large, the books, especially in books more than TV until recently, the books that did better tended to have less of that problem. Not necessarily none of it, but less of it. For instance, the Harry Potter series is extremely well known. It has some things of that nature, but it's not anywhere near as bad as Buffy got to by season 6 or whatever. So there's that. But books are changing very much, as TV is, and for similar reasons. With the advent of things like Netflix and Kindle Unlimited, it's print, or not print, but written word cousin. People are becoming binge readers and binge viewers very much. And I've definitely had some conversations with other authors about this. And it's one of the reasons I'm going to finish series 1 first, is because it's gotten to a point where there's a large subset of readers who won't even pick up your book. They're just not even interested until there's at least 4 or 5 of them in a series. And it's because they want to sit down and be able to finish book 1, go right into book 2, go right into book 3, whatever, and have a whole set to read. Not, I've read your book and now I want to wait a year before I read book 2. So you're absolutely right that that's the direction things are heading. And we all know that's how TV is heading. You have to be living in a cave somewhere not to have figured that out about television yet. We even recently canceled our cable altogether, and we just watch stuff on Netflix and Amazon Prime. And yeah, we're definitely looking for stuff to binge watch. And for those who watch the original series on both of those networks, they're starting to write the shows differently because of that as well. There's a lot less, here's what happened last week, recap in any given episode, because they're not assuming anymore that it's been a week since you saw the show. They're assuming that you paused it for 30 seconds to go to the bathroom and get a Coke before you start the next episode. And because that's how we watch those shows now. Even my wife and I, who have very limited time, when we binge watch those shows, we're watching 2 to 4 episodes in a night. And you're catching quite a bit, even on a full 22 episode TV series. 4 episodes in a night, you're catching almost a sixth of a season on that.
And
so
I think it's going to put a pressure in. I am very profoundly cynical about TV writers on a number of levels, but I think at least it will put a lot of pressure on them to not play as fast and loose with continuity as they're used to having a free reign of doing. And it's something I realized, for a lot of shows, and it's one of the great things about older shows when they didn't have a continuity is they couldn't screw it up. It's something like Hogan's Heroes, which I'm very fond of. Early 70s, if memory serves, mid 70s, the latest. And it didn't, each episode stands entirely on its own, doesn't have any sort of continuity. And as a result, they can't screw the continuity up. They can't, they never established anything that they then rely on later or violate later. And so there isn't that problem. It was only really, I think, in the, what was it? A lot of people date it to Babylon 5, right? When television started.
That's the one that I use. And I think there've probably been some other shows that started doing continuity before that. There are shows that have done continuity before that. I mean, soap operas have done continuity since they existed, basically.
Well, yes.
But Babylon 5 is what really made it more mainstream. After they did it, while they were doing it, Deep Space Nine switched to that same kind of format. And then, ironically enough, the show we've been discussing already, Buffy, was one that, was one of the next shows to take it even more mainstream. And it kind of spiraled from the mid 90s onward. It kind of stepped, more and more shows started doing it to where now it's the normal. One of the things...
Skill.
What's that? No, not on the same scale. Because what they do now, nobody wants to do anything crazy. Because writing a 5-year series and having the whole plot up front is a little bit insane. But what they do now, the standard on television is that they basically have a season plot at a time. So they know a season at a time. What they're doing on TV now is the standard. Well, Netflix especially, but Amazon too, it's kind of going to the next level now where they're filming an entire season at a time. And they've written the entire season first. Before they even start filming, they've got it all done. They're ready to go. And bam, here's a season. They drop the whole season on the same day, and you're binge watching it and you're going. So it's definitely changing the way they write those shows. There's no question about it. If you watch some of them, it's very clear that they're writing the show differently for that. One of my personal favorite examples of that is the show Stranger Things. If you've
heard of it, never seen it.
Oh, you should go watch it. You should just pull it. If you've got Netflix, pull it up, watch it right now. It's a phenomenal show. It's really, really good. But it's very clearly a story told over one season, and they clearly, they know what they're doing, they know where they're going, and they know all of that. So it's changing that. And I think that one effect it will have is exactly what you say, is over time, the audiences are becoming more sophisticated with this as well. And, as you're watching, if you're watching 4 seasons in a row over the course of a month, you're kind of starting to expect that those 4 seasons make some kind of coherent sense as well. And I think you're going to see more and more of people having to think this through ahead of time, and not necessarily a whole 5-season plot like Babylon 5 had, but at least a world that's consistent that you can work in over 5 seasons, because people are seeing it now. And it's much easier to retcon everything when you have, that happened 5 seasons ago, or the comic book world of, that happened 20 years ago in a story, than it is to retcon it when, no, I saw that last week. Yeah, it's just the way human memory works. So even the less sophisticated viewers over time are going to come up to speed and start to expect that, I think.
And there's another thing too, because a lot of the time, and I remember, something I get growing up a little bit, being, one of those people with a better memory, that this sort of thing was problematic even in episodic television if you have a good memory. And getting that pushback from other people whose memory was not as good about, like, you worry too much, you're just nitpicking. But in fact, it does directly affect your ability to suspend disbelief. That an inconsistent world is one that you simply can't suspend your disbelief about, because if you remember both inconsistencies, there's no way to suspend your disbelief. You can't possibly
Right.
believe both halves of a contradiction at the same time. And if you remember them both, I think this really gets to what you're saying about, by pushing everything much closer, we're now having, even people with more average memories are remembering the inconsistencies. Um, that it makes it harder to enjoy, even, not necessarily on a conscious level, but on a subconscious level, that if you have to, stop remembering the story in order to defend your brain against the inconsistencies in the story, it's still going to make the story less enjoyable. And
Right.
so I think it's something that we're, obviously, we're never going to get a world in which everyone enjoys fiction the same way that I do. So, I'm not trying to build the argument up for that like soon everyone will be just like me. But at the same time, I think it is something that does, as we're seeing, trends to more important. And if nothing else, if you take two stories told equally well and one of them makes sense and the other one is an incoherent disaster, you're going to enjoy the one that makes sense if they're both told equally well. So for any given author who can tell a story, it's not like it's going to make a worse story by having a consistent universe that actually makes sense.
Right. And yeah, a good example of what you're talking about is the classic William Shatner versus the Trekkies feud from the late 70s and early 80s, where back in those days, the only people who cared that much about the story continuity were the nerds. So you have the classic scene of William Shatner at a Star Trek convention telling everybody to get a life. And that's just how the world was then. But like you say, now more and more people are catching on to that because the way we consume this media has changed. And yeah, I absolutely agree that it's a case where, and that's something I'll say too. You talk about being cynical about TV writers, and I agree. There's a lot of reasons to be cynical about them. But one thing I will also say is I've gone back and tried to watch 80s television in recent years, and television is so much better than it's ever been right now.
Well, actually, let me throw something out there. 80s television was in many ways particularly bad. Go back to 70s, go back to the 60s and 50s, because I actually had a little project for a while, a year or two ago, when I was going and doing some research into television history, because it only really starts in about the 1940. Basically, it starts in 1950, roughly speaking.
Right. Yeah.
And so I went back, like I watched a few episodes of Wagon Train. I watched a few episodes of Gunsmoke, and actually, like, those were really good. Actually, much better than I happen to have a fondness for Murder, She Wrote, but let's be honest, it's pretty bad. I mean, it's got some good qualities, but a lot of it is pretty bad. And actually, I think like there's kind of a fascinating thing where in the 80s there's a bunch of new stuff, but like it actually they weren't telling very good stories in the 80s. Well, and compare that to fascinating episodes of Gunsmoke, Wagon Train, and so on, where like the acting was really good, the plots were actually really good, and good plot carries a lot of, editing was not nearly as tight, but on the other hand, a good plot will carry you through much looser editing.
A good plot will carry you through a lot, and that's one thing a lot of people, even to this day, don't understand about Star Trek. To use an example we've already used. That's another world, actually, where a lot of the stuff they've set up, it's not theological, it's not mystical, it's not any of that. But that's another world where, honestly, a lot of what they've done in that world makes no sense. It's incoherent, it's a mess, it's been retconned a million times, and everything in it.
Especially in the Next Generation.
Yeah, and honestly, every new series they add, it becomes more and more incoherent. Their entire model of what they've done. It's just, and for all the same reasons we've already discussed. But one thing people don't realize about why that show was so successful, go back and look at the writing credits for that show. And oh, wow. That is a who's who list of classic science fiction writers. The number of people who were writing for that show who went on to major literary careers they're not known outside of science fiction at all, which is why nobody even thinks of it. People who are only science fiction fans, that are really just Trekkie fans, not science fiction fans, don't have any clue who these people are. But you have folks like Harlan Ellison. You have folks like oh man, I can't even remember half of them now.
Rod Serling.
Rod Serling. Go look at the writing credits. Just pull them up, and you'll see that. Which is why Star Trek, even the original series, exhibited the trait that has stuck with Star Trek through every incarnation it's been in, which is that when it's good, it's really good, and when it's bad, it's really bad. And it had it in the beginning series, because you can look and you can see, that episode was great. Oh, that's the guy who wrote it. Well, of course it was great. So yeah, there's definitely something to what you're saying about TV in the 80s as well. And the 80s was, I will freely admit, was it had everything you're saying about just something about the decade being just off. But TV at that point had also devolved basically into a complete, the 80s shows are the worst one to watch in today's environment as a binge viewer. Because the 80s shows are the ones that had really descended into, we have the master formula plot for this show, and we're going to do the same plot every episode. And my personal favorite example of that is a show that I love. I absolutely love, but you cannot binge watch more than about 3 episodes in a row, is The A-Team. I love the show. And I actually, it has a certain level of 80s cheeseball to it. But I would argue that it's not a bad show. It's a cheesy show, but not a bad show. But every episode is the same story. Yeah. New location, new actors to play the characters filling the same roles. And it's the same plot all over again. And, that works when you're watching an episode every week. You have no VCR. You can't record any of this, so you don't remember what happened last week, much less what happened last year. And you're just tuning in for some humor. But, boy, that does not work in the Netflix era.
No, I haven't watched Netflix. I've seen similar things. And, I mean, the 80s had – the history of it fascinates me. The history of television I actually find – really interesting. I got really, really interested in it when I realized, because I had been, as a kid, I had seen people who would talk about the history of television, and they could trace all sorts of things back to their origins and all these shows I'd never heard of, and I was just astonished at their mastery of all this arcane lore. And then I got a few years older and realized, well, no, at the time they were doing this, there was only 30 years of television to be familiar with.
Right.
And that's pretty darn doable. I mean, especially for people who were, in their 50s and their 60s at the time when they were doing this, they had seen all these shows when they ran.
They lived through it. It wasn't a case of, oh, look, I'm going to learn all this history. It's just a case of, I just remember watching all these shows.
Exactly. So like when Star Trek was described as Wagon Train to the Stars, that was by people who had watched Wagon Train when it was airing. And for most people, I think, our age, you hear Wagon Train to the Stars, and what does that really mean?
Right.
And for the benefit of anyone viewing, Wagon Train was a show in the 50s, and I think it ran through the 60s. It was pretty long running. But it was literally about wagon trains in the Old West, where the main characters ran wagon trains, where they're professional wagon train runners. And if people wanted to move out west, they would be in charge of the wagon trains, because these are people going to where they had no idea how to survive, so somebody should have some idea of how to stay alive on their trip out west. And that was the people who ran the wagon train. So you get new characters in terms of the people going, the people they meet in different towns and so on, but stable core in terms of the people running it. And that had a very strong similarity to Star Trek, where you had the core of the people who were going around, but always to a new environment with new people and so on, occasionally ferrying people around too. So there was a very strong similarity. I think Wagon Train to the Stars was how it was pitched or something like that.
I think it was, yeah.
But again, as a kid, when, my mom was a big original Star Trek fan, literally had the individual VHS box, because there's the cheaper one where you had 2 per VHS tape. She had the more expensive, slightly original one, where it's 1 VHS tape per episode. And every single episode, and man, did I watch those things over and over again
Hmm.
um, with her. And anyway, um, so I got into this real kick of watching this stuff, being interested in the history of it. And there's also another thing that happened, because the people who are writing, I like looking at the generational things. It's one thing, living as we are in something of a degenerating culture. Um, Degeneration happens by generations, and I love to point out it's in the name, even degeneration,
Yeah.
generation. But people who are, a lot of people mistake the fact that human beings have two stages: the formative stage as children, and the much less, the formed stage, in which changes are much more minor as adults. And so a lot of people forget that, like, if you decide to reject something that you're raised with as an adult, it's still mostly with you anyway. It takes a
Right.
really long time to overcome it. Um, those of us who are converts to religion know this problem in reverse, that it takes a long, long time to really get acculturated
Absolutely.
to it.
Yep.
Yeah, well, anyway, so a lot of people who reject something as adults don't realize, for whatever dumb reason, that it's going to be very, very different if you raise a person without the thing that you have rejected than you having grown up with it and then rejected it as an adult.
I,
And that's
I,
why degeneration happens by generations. Because
I see
you
that.
reject things, not much happens, but the next generation never had it at all,
I
and so
see
things are
that.
very different.
I
Sorry.
see that happening with a number of my friends, actually, who were raised in a, well, just to use the degeneration model, they were raised in a somewhat more relaxed religious environment than their own parents grew up in, but they were still raised in a religious environment. And so I see many of these people going on social media making comments about, well, oh, you say that you need religion to provide you a moral framework for all these things, but I have no religion and yet I still do all these things and I'm a moral person. And I'm like, well, yeah, because you were raised that way by people who had religion. And your children probably won't be that way. They won't value the things you value. They will, because they will grow up the way you grew up, looking at your religion thinking, well, this religion thing doesn't make any sense. So you get to adulthood and you reject it. Well, your children are going to grow up thinking, my dad's morals don't make any sense at all. And why? Well, they don't make sense because your dad doesn't have the religious framework that made them make sense. So somebody's going to reject that.
Yeah,
And
so
move on
something
from there.
people don't realize about kids, I don't know why, but they
Well,
want good
and
explanations for why they shouldn't do the thing they want to do.
it's almost like you've met my son. the They do. They want good explanations for why they do the things they do, and if you can't give them one, then many of them won't do the things you want them to do.
And on the flip
And
side, and the really big one, is if you tell them no, they want a really good explanation for no. They
yes,
want a rock
especially they
solid, completely logical, unassailable explanation for no.
absolutely,
Otherwise, they're very, very, very skeptical about your no.
yeah, and they don't need anywhere near as much explanation for a yes. Oh, cool, I get to do what I want. I don't need an explanation for that because I want to do it. So that's enough explanation. But a no, I need an explanation for. Um, and you know, I don't know. I had somewhere I was going with that. There's a problem in reverse with that as well that I was thinking of, and now it's spun out of my head.
Sorry.
I'll come back in a minute. But yeah, it's a thing that happens, and to go back to our original topic, it happens in the literature as well. When you
Yeah,
throw
that's
out
actually where I
the
was trying to go with it.
when you throw out the framework that you're trying to write, that you're trying to write these stories within, then the sense starts to go out with that. And I'll tie this in. I mentioned this at the very beginning as a great example. Vampires are one of my favorite topics for this, and because
They're
if you
rich in both
throw
good and
out
bad examples.
well, if you throw out the Christian framework that the original vampire folklore existed within, they don't make sense.
Uh,
The They really don't. It's a framework that's specific to what I'll call Christian mythology, which I don't mean to imply that Christianity is a mythology, but there is a framework of mythological tales and folklore that has grown up around Christianity as it's because people create folklores and myths around what they know.
Yeah, mythology is a literary style, so
right. And vampires, the vampire creature is a very deeply Christian creature. People like to talk about how that exists in every culture out there and but it doesn't. Not quite the way we think of a vampire. There are things that have elements of vampire. There are things that I would say are revenants, as a more general class, but a vampire specifically is a very Christian thing. And it's very metaphorically Christian as well. It's a creature that is really, it's conveying, in a way, it's showing this is what happens to you if you aren't a good Christian. And this is what happens. Even the symbolism of the vampire, the drinking of the blood, that's Christian symbolism right there. It's a mockery of the Eucharist. It's down to its core, the entire vampire legend is just deeply Christian.
Oh, very rich about the dangers of idol worship and how eventually, because it's looking essentially for the Eucharist in the wrong place, which is what an idol is looking for God in the wrong place, but also how one turns upon one's idols, how this becomes destructive of the thing being idolized, which you can also see in human relationships. If a person tries to make another human being the center of their life, they end up becoming the person that about whom they orbit, that person never wants to be around, because they become metaphorically a vampire. They're trying to suck the life out of the person. They become incredibly destructive of that thing. It's richly metaphoric for all of that.
It is. And the other place you really see it, again, is rich in metaphor there, deeply rich in metaphor, is in all the weaknesses of a vampire. What are the weaknesses of a vampire? Sunlight. The light of God is a weakness to these creatures. Why can't they bear the light? Because they've rejected it and they've gone to the world of darkness so deeply. Well, what's the world of darkness? The world of darkness is the world of Satan. It's a direct metaphor. It's not even it's folk metaphor, which means it's not even deep. It's coming from it's coming from the peasants who made this metaphor. They're not deep philosophers. This is right on the surface. They're going to Satan, and that's why they're rejecting the light.
Well, there's another great metaphor too, with light being truth and darkness, and Satan is the father of lies.
Absolutely.
So again, the vampire, who is a mockery of a human being, who looks like a human being, but only as long as you don't look at them as long as you don't look at them too closely. So in dim light, they can pass for human. That only in the world of lies can they even exist. In the truth, they can't survive.
Absolutely. And their very form as an undead as well is a mockery and a symbolism. It's a mockery of the resurrection. It's a symbolism of it's the resurrection gone completely wrong. This is if you go the path of the devil, this is the kind of resurrection you get. Not the true resurrection of Christ, in which you're reborn as a wonderful, in the heavenly sense. You're reborn in this just corrupted, evil sense. But look at the other symbolism, like the great trope that just makes me want to laugh. That's so common now in modern vampire lore is, well, any symbol of faith will repel a vampire because it's faith. Well, that doesn't make sense. Why does faith repel a vampire? That makes no sense. The only reason that makes sense is, amusingly, is if you go back to the original lore, and faith repels them because faith is of the light and of the good and of God. So when you've already rejected God, it doesn't make sense. But by the flip token of it, if a crucifix or a cross repels a vampire in a Christian worldview, that makes sense. You have a symbol of the light and the good and God that is rejecting your symbol of the darkness and the corruption and the evil and Satan. It makes sense. You cannot agree with Christian theology. That's fine. But within that framework, you have to admit that it makes sense. So what happens?
Also, the other stupid trope about UV light burns vampires.
Right.
You've seen that one where, again, so because I mean, one of
what's it, the Blade film where he's putting on sunscreen so he can go out in the sunlight. I love that film too. It's a fun film. I'm a big Wesley Snipes fan, and that's just stupid.
I mean, it did have that great line, "Your mascara's running," but other than that, the other ridiculous, most of them they'd wear motorcycle helmets in place of the sunscreen.
Right.
Yeah, but the thing about the UV light, of course, within the traditional folklore, in the night, the vampire rules the night. That in the night, when, in the night, there's that separation between day and night, and so the night becomes the realm of the vampire. But night is also reliable. So just from a story structure perspective, the vampire has a time when the vampire is relatively safe, and they only come out at that time when they're relatively safe. If you have UV light is the relevant thing, it's not even visible to a vampire. Well, I don't know what chromophores they have in their eyes, but that said, you can shine UV light at any time, so you can.
That leads me to another problem with the modern vampire tropes. This is somewhat true of the classical vampires as well. But many of these modern vampire tropes, they do all these things. So, okay, we can get our vampires out in the daylight so we can do something, which most of the time is really just a budgetary issue, because it's a lot cheaper to shoot during the day than it is to shoot at night. The reason we're cynical of TV writers.
Yeah.
But the other thing that happens from it, the other thing that happens from it is, if you start to think this through and you think through all these things we've made, most versions of vampires shouldn't really pose much of a threat at all in the modern world.
No.
If your vampire, if it's UV light that kills your vampire, not sunlight, UV light, good Lord, I can go down to Home Depot and buy a 6-pack of them right now for $30. I can flood my house with that stuff. I mean, you're thinking, you watch these movies and these vampires are posing such a threat, and I'm like, well, the way you've set up your structure, a halfway competent SWAT team ought to be able to take out all these vampires in seconds. This would be a joke.
Yeah. Well, I could see the vampire going to a club, and then someone pulls out the UV light to check his license and accidentally burns his hand off.
I'm going to have to use that story somewhere, Chris. I'm not sure where yet, but I'm going to put that in, because that's too good. It's that stupid, though. It's that retarded.
Is. And out in the West, sorry.
It's a case, again, of the exact point we're making, is once you throw out the framework that's been through centuries of people thinking it through for you, now you have to think it through yourself, and you won't do as good a job.
Yeah, if your odds are really, really, really good, you won't. I mean, maybe if you're a professional, theologian, you have a chance.
Right.
J.R.R. Tolkien actually managed to do a fairly good job. And he did. Granted, he was a linguist,
but also realized that most of his theology and worldview that he created was directly, intentionally meant to be modeled off of the Christian theology and model view. So, yeah, he created his own, but in a sense, he really borrowed and renamed and filed off the serial numbers from the Catholic religion he belonged to already. And it's all there. It's very much just that.
Yeah, no, that's very true. That he did essentially take a lot of concepts and just rename them and fit them in. And I mean, as I understand it, it doesn't take that much. I'm not a huge Tolkien fan myself. You know, someday I'll.
We like you anyway.
I was laid low by Tom Bombadil. But it's again just a personal failing. I cannot see songs written down and read them without having some idea of what the tune is. And like I forced myself through a few of Tom Bombadil's songs, then eventually I just gave up because I couldn't get through the song.
I'm a massive Tolkien fan. I've read the book probably as many times as you've read Pride and Prejudice, and I've read the Tom Bombadil sections like twice. I mostly just skip them and move on to the next section. It's a similar issue, you know. It's I would imagine that somebody really gifted musically could read those sections and put some kind of music behind it themselves and make it work. I can't do that. I have no musical talent whatsoever, so that just doesn't happen.
Yeah, you know,
but I do know people who love those scenes and just rave about them. It's their favorite part of the book.
I think I've heard of such a person myself. I just, you know, we all have our weaknesses, but you know, I'm a big fan of admitting one's limitations. I actually did a video, one of my favorite videos that I did, on admitting that you're weird. That it makes social situations work tremendously better when you're weird. Just admit it up front, and it makes everything much better. You know, people don't feel threatened by it.
Yeah,
people,
you know, you're weird.
Yeah, you know, like you know, the example I used, I shoot an 80-pound bow, you know, for bow hunting, and that's very typical. You know, a lot of bow stores only stock up to 70-pound bows.
Mm-hmm.
You know, modern compound bows are so efficient, most people don't need to bother. But you know, I'm a big guy; it's not hard for me. I like it, etc. And so, you know, they make fun of me for shooting, you know, those armor-plated deer out here in Western Pennsylvania, and you know, I just joke along with them. Yep, I'm crazy. Just have fun doing it. And then it stops because, you know, people can't just keep on agreeing with you. That's not much of a conversation. And so, you know, then you just move on and go on to what you have in common. One
thing about admitting that you're weird in a social situation is that it also kind of gives your social partner in that sense the freedom to admit that they're weird. And then you can just get on with life. So yeah, I can see how that helps.
It really does. It's so I'm a big fan of just being upfront. And you know, relatedly, like, you know, there are lots of things in life I don't get. And if I'm just, you know, blunt about the fact that like we all have our weaknesses and there are things that I just don't have the power to enjoy. I'm not saying there's not something enjoyable there, just I'm not good at enjoying it. It's, you know, for one thing, it's accurate, and accuracy is often very helpful. And for another thing, this is not an implicit criticism of anybody, so there's nothing that needs to be responded to. So talking about, you know, like the transplanting, secularization of transplanting of things, and in particular, the secularization of things that were either religious or magical. One of the worst ones, in my experience, is zombies. That zombies.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, like I mean, the original zombie, you know, the idea of somebody who has used magic to essentially, you know, summon a spirit to reanimate a corpse. A lot of their properties, you know, as we sort of have the zombies, the slow shuffling things, etc., make a fair amount of sense. It's not a perfect, in general, representation of the original zombie, but you know, in any event, nonetheless, it still works fairly well when they're magical. Everyone lately in Western society seems to want to turn them scientific, and they make not even a lick of sense scientifically.
No, the virus zombie is one of my most hated tropes in fiction right now. I kind of see why somebody decided to try that. They're like, oh, hey, we can do this, and no. If you know much about viruses and the human body and how this works, it really doesn't make sense. The biggest problem right off the bat is like it's still got to get energy from somewhere.
Yes.
This is just a thing. It's got to have. Where's the energy coming from? Which, of course, is a thing that's conveniently ignored in quite a bit of fiction. It's the biggest problem with the Iron Man suit as well, which okay, he's got his little arc
Oh,
reactor thing.
I thought he had a super magic thing that.
Yeah, essentially they solved that problem with magic, but
well, yeah. Well, that's the Marvel way. You have the super genius who, through sheer intellect, can discover new bits of physics unknown to anybody else, and then just twiddle the right things, and there you go, unlimited energy.
But I mean, that's the major problem with that suit in modern technology. We can build most of the things in that suit. It probably larger than his suit has, but we can build them, and we could make something work. Something the size of the suit they show in the movies these days, probably not so much. But the giant Hulkbuster suit, yeah, we could build an Iron Man suit about that size that would do all of it if we could power the stupid thing. If we could power it, we could make that work, and we probably have the tech to do that and engineer it. And you have the same problem with the virus zombies. Where's the energy coming from?
I actually once worked out the calculations for assuming anaerobic respiration, and throwing in a bunch of highly favorable assumptions here that the zombie is essentially just metabolizing its own muscles. Because the problem is you can't really get the fat. Fat metabolism requires fat metabolism requires oxygen anyway. There isn't there's pretty much not there's no important.
They're not breathing.
yeah. Well, and there's no circulatory system running either. So even if they're breathing, it wouldn't get to anything. So there's no important fat metabolism that's going to be going on in a corpse. And so the upshot is they can basically be going through the anaerobic stages of certain aspects of like protein and glucose use, but basically speaking, about the longest with astonishingly overgenerously favorable assumptions is about half an hour before they just completely run out of energy. I mean, their muscles will have already degenerated, because they're cannibalizing their muscles at that point. Their muscles will have degenerated to the point where they're not strong enough to actually stand anyway before that. So they probably would have something like 5 to 10 good minutes where they could actually do some damage to you if they caught up with you.
Right. And the other issue with the virus zombie, and this kills me, is so often, not always, sometimes they're genetically engineered. Most of the time, they're genetically engineered and then they evolved. Well, okay, they evolved into this viral zombie state, but why? What environmental pressures, what evolutionary pressures caused them to evolve into that? Because that doesn't make any sense from an evolutionary perspective. Like there's no natural selection that pushes them to that state. It's like this isn't how viruses evolve. We know how viruses evolve in the real world. We have epidemiological studies of how viruses evolve. One thing people don't realize is that viruses, when they evolve, typically become less deadly, not more. Because the super deadly version doesn't spread. It kills the host too fast. So over time, they typically become less bad as they evolve. That's not universal, but it's typically the pattern. So
the extreme version being feline AIDS.
Right.
Feline HIV is something that is completely harmless to the host. And so it's incredibly common among big cats, as I understand it. And it does absolutely no damage of any kind. Works out very, very well for the virus.
Yeah, and that's why they tend to evolve that way. The common cold is probably the perfect virus. It shows up. It makes you sick. It makes you sick in a way that spreads it. And then it goes away and you're fine. But it does it in such a way that it keeps spreading and it never dies. And it evolves rapidly. So we haven't been able to create a good vaccine for it because it evolves too rapidly. It's very close to the perfect virus. It's going to be a long time before we ever get rid of that one because it evolves so rapidly and it's so non-lethal. It's just evolved to spread, and that's what viruses typically evolve towards because that's
so
the model that works for them.
Sorry, it's so non-lethal. People don't even stay away from you when you have it.
No, look. We live in a world that basically pushes us to go to work all the time. Most of us go to work with common cold. I've done it. I'm sure you've done it. Everyone. they tell us not to. Oh, you're sick, you should stay home. But then when it actually shows up as time to stay home, they're like, no, we need you in today. You better get in here if you want to keep your job and get promoted and get paid.
Yeah,
So,
well, I mean, plus everyone needs to, if you use, most people don't get the 12, 14 sick days a year that you would need for using them on a
right,
common cold.
exactly. So, that's what viruses typically evolve into, not super zombie land. So
It's
it
even
doesn't.
weird. Well, also too, okay, granted, a lot of the virus zombie styles actually infect living people, and then they just start shuffling around as zombies. And so, because
Right.
a lot of them do move away from the dead thing, I really love to know though, for the ones that haven't, how exactly do you infect a corpse with a virus?
Right. There's
I
no
mean, once you put
circulatory system to transmit it. To circulate it through the body. There's no respiratory system to get it into the lungs. There's no, yeah.
there's no
How?
cellular reproduction to reproduce the virus.
No. How do you do that? You're exactly. I will tell you. I'll put a shout out in for a friend real quick because I read his book not too long ago. It's one of the few modern zombie books that I actually liked, and it's because his version. A slight spoiler for the book. It's A Place Outside the Wild by Daniel Humphreys. And a slight spoiler for the book, sorry, is the zombies turn out to be nanotech driven. So it solves a number of the problems here. How did they get that way? Well, because they were deliberately programmed to be that way. And how is circulation still happening? How is how is any of this? How is energy still happening? Well, because you have nanobots that were specifically programmed to make this happen.
Mm.
I can buy that scenario.
Yeah.
In a world where nanobots exist, it still requires a little bit of a stretch, but I can suspend my disbelief for that because I can at least see some level that makes sense because it's intentional at this point. Somebody wanted to create zombies, and they used a tech-based solution to do it.
That does make sense, and moreover, you can fill in the gaps in your imagination of
exactly.
There are a number of problems, but since they were trying to solve these problems, they probably tried to solve these problems.
Exactly.
None of which applies to the virus.
And the author did it in such a way where he doesn't try to fill in all those gaps for you. He just, he leaves it free so that you can, just either fill them in yourself if you have such knowledge, or just assume that somebody solved these problems and run with it. And it kind of works because some of what we said, and also because nanotechnology is so new to us that we can still accept it as magic.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the annoying thing about the zombie viruses is that, especially the ones that work on corpses, I mean, because some of them, I've seen some of them that just sort of verged into, I saw this one movie on the airplane that I was watching somebody else's iPad, so I couldn't hear any of the sound, but that's okay because it seemed like a pretty bad movie anyway. But there was text on the screen in a few places, and it turned out it was the rage virus, which these were fast zombies that as soon as you got infected, granted, ludicrously faster than you could ever reproduce RNA.
It's the rage virus. That's one of the Resident Evil movies, right?
I couldn't tell you. This is England gets completely depopulated, and then they start coming back. But then there was
it's probably 28 days later.
Yeah. Well, except it was way more than 28 days later. I mean, it was like months after England was depopulated that they started bringing people back, but there turned out to be one survivor who was, a carrier for it. And then her husband kissed her and then got infected from it and then started another epidemic because he just got the... Yeah, anyway, it looked like a very bad movie, but there were like hyper fast-paced zombies who would chase people. But again, you get to these problems like, okay, so you've got the virus who completely depletes people's reason, and now they're just like literally frothing at the mouth, killing machines, running as fast as they can to kill anybody. But somehow they all recognize each other as off limits. Somehow they can tell across a field, that guy has not been infected by the virus I've been infected by, but that guy running after him has. So I'm not going to attack him. I'm only going to attack the guy who's healthy.
Right. And again, that's an issue that makes sense with a nanobot zombie virus because they're in communication somehow as within the body. in order for this to work. So it makes sense that they're in communication outside the body also. Like it's a solution that's believable.
Yeah.
Again, there's problems you have to solve to make that work if you know nanotech, but you can scratch your head and just say, okay, it's written in the future, it's science fiction, we'll accept that somebody solved those problems.
Yeah, no, it does work. Yeah, the worst of them is the one that the virus that brings people back to life. Because
yeah,
by the time you're doing that much magic, why not just apply it to cars too? I mean, why shouldn't it bring back a car whose fuel pump doesn't work and make the thing drive down the road even though its gas tank is empty?
well, and at that point, why not just use magic?
Well, exactly. And magic really solves that problem vastly, vastly better. But there's actually a very interesting thing you were bringing up about the nature of gaps and not filling in gaps. And one of the really, really important things in, I think, science fiction is having a good sense as an author what not to explain.
Absolutely.
And more generally than science fiction, though, generalizing that lesson, when it comes to characters and character motivations, I think the cardboard cutout villain has been often maligned without proper understanding, because, and I like to use the example of Darth Vader from the original Star Wars movie.
Mm-hmm.
You have no idea why he's doing anything of what he's doing. But at the same time, absolutely no reasons have been eliminated as possibilities either. We simply don't know. We're not in a case where all reasonable possibilities have been eliminated, and so that's something I think that was, and especially in the 80s, and this is one thing about the 80s being a sort of bad time for storytelling in certain areas, because I remember like the late 80s into the 90s, the whole like trying to flesh out your villains, which often resulted in much, much worse villains. Not morally worse, just poorly written villains.
Badly written.
Yes. Where someone would try to, make their villainy intelligible, and so that, the worst form of it, I think, is the one where eventually you get the sort of inverted story where the protagonist is a misunderstood villain and the antagonist is a misunderstood hero. You only find out afterwards that you've been sort of rooting for the worst guy in the entire story. House, the TV show, is kind of like that, but where you just learn over time, like, the main character is awful. There actually eventually became this series where some guy, the Dr. House, screwed somebody over, who was a miserable drug addict. I don't know if you've ever seen House.
I have not.
He's a doctor who's this utterly miserable misanthrope who just happens to be a brilliant doctor for cases that no one else can figure out. And so whenever, everyone, when they're butting their heads up against this, can't figure this out for really bad situations, they bring them to House, and then House figures out what's wrong. And so that's why he's got a job, even though he is one of the more miserable bastards you've ever seen. And he's also an opiate addict, and exhibits many of the actually bad things that opiate addicts will do to the people around them. So they're kind of realistic about that. But the end result was like a few seasons in, there was something where he screwed somebody over for no good reason. It was an asshole guy. Turned out to be a fairly high-ranking police officer who then went on to notice that House, of course, was an addict and therefore is going to be breaking all sorts of laws. And so sort of went on a crusade to try to throw House behind jail. House is his last name, but anyway, behind bars. And eventually he would have succeeded were it not for all of House's friends sort of agreeing to commit perjury in court to save him for no good reason. And the thing is, throughout this, like, I didn't feel he was in jeopardy. I was rooting for the cop because this guy's awful. Which is sort of the extreme end of that.
And, well, it's definitely a spot we've gotten to. And it's, I'm frustrated by a lot of this as well. This is a problem I see in a lot of storytelling where I think this is a degeneration issue, like you say. We've gotten to a point where so much of what passes for literature and high-quality film these days is deconstruction of something that's gone before, and I'm not intrinsically opposed to that. I've seen some deconstruction done very well, and sometimes we need to examine ourselves better than that and have a little bit of it. But it's become so normal now. It's the thing, and the thing about deconstruction is that it's easy. It's always been easier to destroy than to create, to to quote another series we talked about a lot earlier in this show. It's always been easier to destroy than to create, and it's the easy way out when you're deconstructing something. And most of the time, it's really not very good. And what you end up with is you end up with characters that you don't relate to because they're horrible people. You end up with characters that they're maybe interesting, but they're bastards. I mean, there's just like these guys no good.
Half the
One
time,
that
they're not even interesting. I mean, one of the things, and this is, I think, a property of the Netflix era, but something I've noticed is that for a lot of these TV shows, they become like it's something, especially in TV that I've seen, not as much in other media, but it's the sort of thing where, like, the plot formula you have is, roughly speaking, you paint yourself into a corner, then build a hut around yourself that you then paint the inside of, and then just magic yourself to the other side of the room. And I mean, a great visual for this is although it's not directly related, is the thing you see this all over the place in action stuff where somebody falls off a building, and you see them falling for a while to the point where they are very, very clearly beyond the reach of anybody anywhere nearby to help. And then, you cut to commercial, and then when you come back, someone grabs their hand, and they're like, 15 yards closer up than they clear. Because, in normal physics, you can tell how far something away is by the amount of time it's been falling in normal thickness air, and they were falling for way, way too long to be within reach of a person's arm. And it's that same thing. It's a great physical metaphor for the way people will write these stories, where they foreclose all possibilities. And, well, okay, we have gotten rid of all of the reasonable possibilities, so I now know you are not using the reasonable possibility. It's like, have you ever heard that writing advice of upping the stakes of, like, so, there's the main character, and he's surrounded by enemies, and all he's got is a bat. Now break his bat.
Right.
Well, okay, I know at this point, given what you've just set up, that the ring we've seen on him that we didn't know what it does is going to start glowing, and or there's going to be somebody coming in from the outside to save him. I mean, I know which way this is going to end, and well, depending on what sort of thing you can basically predict, whether it's the ring or the other guy, depending on the sort of story they like to tell. But, like, okay, there is now no way this hero is actually legitimately getting out of this, so I know it's just one of these magic solutions. So instead of raising the tension, you've utterly cut the tension, and the tension's just lying on the floor now. And I'm just waiting for the part to get over.
Not having actually seen it, I think the episode of House you described is a good example too. You have a guy who's basically a high-functioning sociopath that nobody likes, and he's saved because all of his friends perjure themselves for him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, wait, how does this guy have friends? I mean, much less the kind who are willing to perjure themselves for him. Now, okay, a guy like that, I could see it if he has a bunch of people where he's basically got something over them, and he's like, you need to perjure yourself for me, or I'm taking this thing away. But friends, people don't lie en masse for that sort of person. They don't. Not voluntarily.
Yeah, no, these are kind of like old college friends who'd been abusing for the last 20 years. Sort of the background setup. I mean, it was, credibility was I don't know, several bus stops ago.
So essentially, like you say, it's a magic answer. We're just going to, okay, these guys are all going to show up and vouch for him all of a sudden for no reason that makes any sense whatsoever, but it saves the day. And it is a problem that often happens with deconstruction.
Oh, what's even worse, by the way, is not only does it not have any content, does it not make any sense with anything that came before, because the entire show is premised around this guy being an ungrateful bastard, it is also impossible to have character development based on this where he actually has some gratitude for this thing. So you then have to also have no continuity with what's happening, which as it's happening, this is going to have no effect on this show.
Well, and again, this is ultimately, if we want to get a little bit more meta, this is a symptom of the exact same problem we started out discussing, because you've thrown out the framework in which this makes sense. In a normal framework with a normal hero, this makes sense. For somebody like my character, Peter Bishop, who's spending his whole life going out helping people and saving people, this makes sense. That's the kind of person who has a whole bunch of friends or even acquaintances who come in and say, that guy saved my life, or hey, that guy rescued my sister, that guy pulled my mom out of a well, whatever. He's in trouble. I'm gonna go. I'll tell a lie for him because maybe he screwed up this one time, maybe he didn't. Whatever the answer is, but he's a good guy, and he doesn't. I've got his back because he helped me. People behave that way in the real world. It's
Yeah.
it's a real thing. It can happen that way.
Yeah, St. Paul said actually that, when he's talking about how remarkable it was that Jesus gave his life for sinners. Who would give his life for another? Maybe for a very, very good man.
Right. Who does that? Not real people. I mean, it's
maybe
not a thing.
For a very, very good man, people would be willing to sacrifice, a lot.
And in the case of Christ, that's part of what makes the story powerful. But in a normal sense, your average person doesn't do that. So getting a whole room full of them together to perjure themselves to save him in court, like that's not gonna happen. And then you run into the even more logical, just thinking it through, of like, how'd they get their stories consistent beforehand? Did they all get together and plan this out as a conspiracy first? Is there
actually, well, in that case, just to be fair to that one point, the one guy perjured himself and the others basically just backed him up at that point. Like, yes, the thing he just said is in fact true. Because they saw his testimony. So when they were called later, because the testimony was public, they just corroborated it.
But the catch to that even there is that good lawyers will pick you apart after that and make sure, and find your story doesn't match with his. And they're really good at that. They're really good at that. If you haven't coordinated beforehand, they're gonna find you out. So it just doesn't it doesn't make sense in any way. And it's a symptom. It's a symptom of replacing the hero with an anti-hero.
That's a really nice, succinct way to put it.
I say that, and I have read some really wonderful books with anti-heroes in them. The one that I would most recommend is the Cold Fire trilogy by C.S. Friedman. And there's the hero of the book who one of his companion is an anti-hero as well. And the trilogy as a whole is fantastic, especially the way the whole series ends. And I wish I could go into more of that without spoiling the story, because it matches well. But that's rare. That's the exception. And that's what happened, is somebody working within the framework of, I've chosen to do an anti-hero. How am I going to make this actually work in a story sense?
They didn't. I presume that you didn't simply like cut and paste, like, I'm going to remove the hero, put the anti-hero, and just use the same story as if I had a hero. He actually
absolutely
designed
not
the story around what he was doing.
No, and okay, major spoiler, but I can't really continue the conversation much without it. Part of it is the way that it works is that the trilogy as a whole is somewhat, though not quite entirely, a redemption story for the anti-hero. So that's a story that works, right? A redemption of an anti-hero character is a story that works.
Incidentally, he's extremely Christian too.
It is, and this is a particular series that is. Interestingly, it's not Christian in certain ways, and yet this is actually a story that was part of what led me to the church. I'll say it that way. It's to me, it's a very fascinating series. But it's also a story about sacrifice and the power of sacrifice and what it leads to. And, you get into that, but the main thing is, the reason it worked in this case is because you had an author who understood, I have an anti-hero. I can't treat him like a hero, even though the anti-hero is really the interesting character in this story, because he's an anti-hero and he's a pretty nasty guy. He's the interesting character, but the story really works because of the redemption arc. If it didn't have something like that, it wouldn't work the way that it does. But that's, we're losing that. We live in a culture that literally has a show named Lucifer, about Lucifer.
That's true. I
And
forgot about that. Yeah.
we've degenerated to that point where we've turned the devil into our hero. And we think we're original when we do this, completely forgetting that Milton did it, long beforehand and far better. Um, and
Although
and
even
and
there,
partly because Milton recognized he's not a hero, which is probably what you were about to say as well.
yeah.
It's a and it just that's the point our culture's gotten to, and there's something wrong about that. To me, even if you're not Christian, there's something wrong about that. There's just, wait, why are we trying to turn the most evil of evil, the definition of evil, into a hero?
Well, I think it's actually a beautiful symptom of the fundamental problem that the modern world is under is it is attempting to find some reason for existing that isn't the only viable reason for existing. And I mean, as such, it is fundamentally attempting to make work something that is utterly unworkable. And so it does make a certain amount of sense that a popular type of story to try to tell is the attempt to try to take something that doesn't work and make it work.
Right.
Because there's that fundamental longing to see an example of something that doesn't work working. Because there's that desperate hope that things aren't actually unworkable.
Right.
And so you can find an example of something that doesn't work working, then okay, that fundamental sense they have that we're in a crumbling culture that doesn't work. Well, that could just be an illusion. It really will work actually, because everything I know is wrong. So I think that's why there's that desperate hope. It's an utter desperation to overthrow what is in fact known.
I think there's some logic to that. I also have to say that if you're trying to make an argument against the conspiracy theorists who believe that people are deliberately trying to undermine Christian religion in our culture, Lucifer really makes it hard to make that case. I mean, you look at a show like that and you're like, you're going to have to work now to convince me that you're not deliberately trying to sabotage our religion. I mean, it's just
fair enough. I mean, there's also a lot of there's also an element though of the sheer desperation for novelty that produces that, like, what has nobody ever done before?
And that to me, that's another symptom of lazy writing. Going back again, and we're cynical of TV writers. It's laziness. You see, the other side of that is shock value. What can I do just to keep shocking my reader?
I saw an amazing example of that recently. You ever see on YouTube? I saw the advertisements for, was it I can't remember which network it's on, but a television show called like Blood Race or something like that. Where like machinery is now powered by human blood. And the weird thing is the advertising copy was quoting people saying things like, I can't believe this is on television. Like, that was their advertising copy, was reading things like, probably made up, frankly. I mean, we don't live in an era where people actually complain about this stuff anymore.
No, because I hit the point where, like, I can't. No, yeah, I believe it's on TV.
Yeah, no, I mean, there was one. I will actually grant there was one scene that was really it was an extended commercial that I happened to like catch because I wasn't in a place to hit the like, okay, skip to the video I want to watch button. And it was this 1950s home where the man comes home and there's the woman with the little baby and she's talking about how the baby missed him and so on, and then says, "Would you please put the baby in the garbage disposal?" And then saying something about like, well, how will the house run? We'll run out of power or something or other if the house doesn't get more blood, something to this effect. And that was because they actually had done like a good job of like really tapping into that, like, feeling of seeing your child after being away from them for a bunch of hours, and then had that that real intense perversion of the most important natural human relationship that exists, that of the parent caring for its child. in violating that. So they did actually manage to shock me just a little bit.
Well, that's a great choice of words, because the honest reality is what it is perverse. And I don't mean that as a put down necessarily. I mean it literally. That is the literal definition of perverse. It's a perversion of our sensibilities. It's going in and hitting that just for mere shock value. And
I mean, most things these days, if you want people to protest you, you have to basically protest yourself.
Right.
I mean, we've seen lots of examples of that, right? Of people, fake protests of things where people have to go and protest themselves because, there's an interesting book. I haven't read all of it. Trust Me, I'm Lying. And it's about a publicity guy who's describing the things, tricks and techniques he's using. I only got a few chapters in, but there was actually what's that that guy who is a professional scumbag, Max something or other, where his whole thing was like he treated women like garbage, and he'd show up in college campuses and women would sleep with him, and then he'd like write books about his life. I think it was Max, something like that. Anyway, the details are relevant. But so this guy, he had like a movie or something.
And Tosh 2.0 or whatever?
No, it's not that guy. It's at least I don't think it is. No, this is someone else. Not Max Payne. I can't remember at the moment. Max Tucker? Something like that? Or no, Tucker Max or something like that. The Max may be his last name or just a stage name or something. Anyway, so he had like a movie or something. So in order to generate publicity, the guy actually went around and like made up posters complaining about the guy and like put them up or something like this. And then, ended up getting news coverage about this. But literally, this is a guy who his entire shtick is bragging about how badly he treats the women he sleeps with. And in order to get anybody to protest his movie, he had to do it himself.
Have you seen I don't know if you have or not, have you seen the new Beauty and the Beast film, the live action Beauty and the Beast film?
No, I've only read your review and two very, very different reviews. Your review and Jackie's husband.
John C. Wright.
Thank you. John C. Wright. Who's blog I follow. You two wrote very, very different reviews of it. I don't know if you saw his review.
One of the things about that film, and I just have to laugh at it because it's the world we live in now, but it's very much in line with what you're saying. Do you remember the huge controversy about the gay moment in the film?
No.
See, that's protest. It's so bad that you don't even remember the controversy about it now. There was a big controversy because somebody went and made a comment of wow, this movie's so amazing because it's got this gay moment. There's this gay character as well. If you actually watch the film, at the very end of the film, there's about a 5-second scene, no joke, where this character, the two male characters, end up dancing on the dance floor, and I don't even think they kiss. Like, there's just a moment of like the gazing into the eyes or whatever. Maybe they do kiss. I don't remember. That's it. And the way the scene is played is actually really funny. It's not even a oh, hey, look, we're just gonna stick this huge homoerotic scene in there. It's just it's funny. And my wife and I came out of that film, and our first response was we're like, they set up the protesting of this on purpose to generate publicity. Like, that's all it was. Like, it got banned in Birmingham or something. Some theater in Birmingham decided they wouldn't show it because of this gay moment, and they played this up for huge publicity. And I'm betting that they paid the theater owner, like, here, just here's some money, go drum up some publicity for us. You're in Birmingham, play along. Your locals will love you for it anyway. We'll pay you a little money, and we'll threaten to sue you, but we don't mean it. And I'm a total cynic these days. I don't believe for a minute that any of that was honest and natural. I absolutely believe they went and drummed up their own publicity, because you can't, other than doing it the way I had described it, you can't buy advertising that has the same effect that has. I know this. I try to buy advertising for multiple businesses. You cannot buy advertising that good. Yeah. It's just, there's no amount of money. It's not a matter of how much you want to spend. There is literally no amount of money that can buy you that kind of publicity.
Nah, you should pay some thugs to jump you outside a bar or something. Get it on local news. To
Yeah,
drum up business.
it would. That's not a bad idea. Maybe I should do exactly that. Like, get a few actors, beat them up, get some mugshots taken, go talk to the local police, get them in on it. Like, buy them a round of drinks afterwards. Just like, you don't even have to really book us. Just get some mugshots for us.
Yeah. No, the funny thing is, like, there are a lot of people who have noticed this very fact that, like, that's, anything that could possibly make the news is vastly better advertising than if you have to pay them to put it on while people skip over it with their DVR. And so, yeah, like, we don't live in a culture in which you can have outrage anymore. I mean, look at how massively Lady Gaga failed to shock anybody, and she'd wear a dress made of meat. People kind of chuckle at it occasionally. That's the sum total of all she ever was able to accomplish trying to outrage people.
And that's the problem with relying on that as a storyteller is it is the lazy way to begin with, but it's like heroin. You never get the same effect of that first hit. You have to keep upping the dose and upping the dose. They build the tolerance for it. You never get that magic first hit again. And our society has built such a tolerance for that you have to go so extreme to do it that you have to throw a baby in a garbage disposal.
Yeah, that will only. I mean, that worked once.
And it's comical, and it's also really depressing because we've gotten so bad that throwing a baby in a garbage disposal only kind of sort of even gets us worked up anymore.
Yeah,
that's what does that say about us as people? Nothing good.
I will say there is an upside, because I'm very slowly working my way through Augustine's De Civitate Dei, the City of God. Very, very big, thick book.
I like all his stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes the confessions look brief by contrast. And the thing is, there's a lot where he talks about contemporary Roman society and the sort of just sheer. I mean, he looks down on it tremendously.
Yeah.
And the way he does, like, as the years progress, like, I'm understanding where he's coming from more and more. Mm-hmm. So, there is that. Like, the classics are becoming more accessible.
There's that, and I think you're getting somewhat. I see this beginning, and I think it's going to get more so. Is that you see people? I guess the best comparison is to somewhat of hitting rock bottom. For a druggie again, is you hit a certain point, and you're like, it's just not even fun anymore. It's boring. It doesn't hold your interest anymore at all. And in the storytelling sense, you kind of have to go back to actual good storytelling to get anything anymore because the shock value just does nothing. They've played that card too many times.
Yeah, well, and the other thing, there's the shock value. There's also just a lot of what goes on, and this gets to back to the degeneration. And I brought it up in the context of television because the thing about not to get into the television, but just the reason why and why it made sense to segue into the stories we're talking about now. The writers in the 80s are people who are 30 years afterwards. So a lot of these people are people who grew up with television existing, whereas the writers in the 50s are people who didn't grow up with television existing. And so it's very different there because they grew up very differently. Even though you don't have things quite growing up, you still have, your fads and then your responses to the fads and the responses to that, where each one sort of feeds off the previous generation, where instead of writing a story for the ages, people write a story for, this month. And so you get that, but it has the property of like a fungus digesting a tree. That it works really well. I mean, you don't have to put much energy at all into having any sort of structure of your own, but only for a while, because the life of fungus is you eat a tree and then, you throw out spores and you're done.
Right.
You can't move on. You've got nothing left. You hollow it out until it, just sort of crumbles. And a lot of there's something, sort of in parallel with the shock value is the deconstruction aspect, where you're just deconstructing the stories that came before you. And a very, very good metaphor for that is what a fungus does to a dead tree. It deconstructs it.
sooner or later you run out of tree, and then what do you do? And you're right, and I think there's a large degree to which our culture's already run out of tree. Um, the deconstructions, like I said, I've seen some that are really interesting, but then you hit a certain point and you're like, well, what's there left to deconstruct? What have you not deconstructed already? And it's much more interesting to create something again, and it's more lasting, and it gives you, something more real when you do that. And of course, there's entire literary movements now centered around that. With the superversive movement, that's their entire point. Is like, hey guys, we've been deconstructing this stuff forever. It's time to stop and start constructing again and doing something good. So, yeah, I totally see that.
It also serves another interesting point because I've got to the point like when it comes to like I am much less trusting of like Hollywood writers and so on than you are. In that, the last time I was in a movie theater was the Get Smart featuring Michael Scott and Anne Hathaway. And I just nothing has seemed worth it to me. And I mean, as much as the Marvel movie's fun, a 10-minute clip job of the action scenes of Avengers seemed to me to be about as good, as much enjoyment as I would get out of the full movie, because the action scenes were great, no question. I mean, they really were. But yeah, like, I mean, when you have a character actually in the film actually explaining the plot holes in your film, 3/4 the way through, and he's right, and there's no response. There's that thing where he explains it, and Tony Stark says, it was a bad plan. Well, yeah, it was. I mean, it really was. I mean, here's a trickster god with a lot of experience in planning, and that was a really bad plan. So the nice thing about this, especially now, I'm probably an extreme example and not representative, but at the same time, one of the real advantages to the movement, because I think a lot of the people in it would have gone this way anyhow, but by having a movement, it does begin to give it it advertises an indication. It advertises an intention that the author is trying to be somebody you can actually trust to tell a decent story.
Right. It does. It kind of conveys that exact thing. It's like, okay, I'm gonna, shy away from this certain set of things that, we've all agreed we don't like, and, try to do something else. So it doesn't necessarily guarantee you'll get a good story out of it, but it guarantees you won't get a certain kind of bad story out of it.
It also guarantees the author's at least trying to tell a good story.
Right.
Because the thing, like, I see this in, I'm at the very, very outskirts of just kind of being aware of the pulp revolution and what people mean by it and so on. So I'm not getting into it because I'm unqualified. But one thing I see people talking about a lot is that, it's not about ideology, it's just about a good story. And yet, there's a complication here, though, because, for example, that guy who, for some odd reason, though he's a novelist, I confuse with Joss Whedon, the one who likes to cross-dress a lot, and Brian Niemeyer's not very fond of him.
John Scalzi.
Yes, thank you, John Scalzi. I've got a friend who liked Old Man's War and was very iffy on red shirts. And he's talked about, but the thing is, like, I read a little bit of John Scalzi's blog, and the guy is a very thoroughly modernist intellectual. I don't know, what's substantially lighter than a feather. Dust mite. Wait. Anyway, yeah, and that's the thing. Like, okay, sure. Like, I'm willing to read a good story regardless of ideology, within limits. Like if you're into actual Satan worship, you know what? Even if it's a good story, there are other good stories in the world. But I don't trust John Scalzi to tell a good story.
Right.
I just don't. I mean, having seen what the guy is like, having read his blog on topics that have some weight to them, I don't trust this guy to tell a good story. I can see no reason in the world to think this guy would tell a good story. And I mean, I'm not, I don't go looking for a good story in the dirt in my backyard. I don't try to read that for a good story. And I see no better reason to try to read John Scalzi for a good story.
Well, it's an example I can say myself. I've never read any of his work either. My sister-in-law has read several of his books and keeps telling me they're great and I should give them a shot. Um, but the one in particular that think she keeps mentioning is Old Man's War. But I have two issues myself with it that have really kept me from like, if you like it, the book, fine. I'm not trying. I haven't read it. I'm not trying to pick on it, but um, one is that I have the same impression of Scalzi that you do. I've seen his blog, and even my sister-in-law, who loves it, prefaces it with, "Yeah, I know the guy's a twerp," but the book is pretty decent. Um, and I've generally heard that even from a number of people who don't like John Scalzi. I've heard that it's a decent book, but also everyone admits that it's pretty much a deconstruction of Heinlein's Starship Troopers. Um, well, I've read Starship Troopers. I liked Starship Troopers, and I'm tired of deconstructions.
Mm.
So I'm like, it's probably fine for what it is, but I've read enough deconstructions. I'm done with that. It's not something I'm interested in at the moment, and that's not even honestly that's not even a criticism of his book. I mean, it could be fine for what it is. It could be one of the rare good deconstructions that I've already mentioned. I have read some. I can't think of them very well off the top of my head, but well, I'll give one example. The musical Wicked
Mm.
is good. The book
I've heard
is
that.
trash. The book that it's based on is pure pornographic trash. It's terrible. The musical is good. It's a good deconstruction of the Wizard of Oz. It's funny how that happens.
Yeah, I
And
heard the same thing about, or something analogous about Interview with the Vampire. No, I've heard different. I know people who like the book too, but a good friend of mine who happens to be a Nietzsche scholar, incidentally, though it's not terribly relevant, mentioned that the book was not very good at all, but the movie actually was quite good. And I don't know if you've seen the movie Interview with the Vampire.
I have read the movie and seen the book, but I did both when I was a teenager, and I no longer trust my opinion of it.
It was a good movie.
I enjoyed them both. I
No
enjoyed them
knowledge.
both, but I was a teenager and my tastes were very different then. And I don't know, I could not say. It's been 20 years since I've either read or seen
Yeah,
the
if
version,
you
so I
have
couldn't
the
give you a fair.
inclination, watch the movie again. I can say because I've seen the movie just a few
Um,
years ago. I've seen the movie about 4 or 5 times now.
well,
Um,
uh, there's a great example because Tom Cruise is a terrible human being, as near as I can tell, but he makes pretty good movies
yeah,
as a general rule.
although he's an
Whatever it
actor,
is,
and there's a sort of special.
he's an actor. There's a special thing, but not every actor has the gift for picking good movies
Mm,
to do that he does. So there's something to that. His movies are generally pretty good.
yeah, no, he
And
has good taste in movies, to be sure, and he's a decent actor. And like, and it's
yeah,
funny because this is something starring Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, and it's a good
right.
movie.
Which is well, I'm actually rather a fan of Brad Pitt as an actor. As a human being, I don't. I try not to be fans or non-fans of celebrities as human beings. That's I don't know them.
That's between them and their confessor.
That's exactly. As an actor, I'm actually a fairly big fan of Brad Pitt. I've seen him in some really good work. And
I don't mean, by the way, incidentally, that either of them is
yeah.
bad. Just that when you have that many pretty guys, you do not normally expect it to be in a good movie.
Oh, that's kind of
One,
the boy band of film,
yeah,
right?
that's the thing. When you have Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt in a movie, you know, by and large, your first instinct would be essentially like this is a boy band.
Yeah,
Except it
it's
actually is a really good movie. Now Anne Rice's vampires were actually metaphors for atheists that she knew during her atheist phase.
um,
Um, Written during,
I
I mean, she actually came out and said this a few
I
years ago.
believe that, and my recollection is that at the time I really enjoyed Interview with the Vampire.
It's
It's
it's not much about vampires exactly, but it's a wonderful metaphor because I mean, their fundamental
it
problems they're wrestling with nihilism.
no, it was kind of the book that kicked off the modern um, referred to in certain circles as the necrobestiality porn.
Yeah, what fangs and abs? I think someone called it.
Vampires. The vampire werewolf romance thing. It's kind of the series that gave us that world of the charming, dapper, hip
Yeah,
vampires, and
I believe
and so
Brian
I,
Lee
I
will never
I
forgive it.
resent I resent the series for that, because what we've gotten as a result of it is trash. But my
Yeah,
recollection is that that series in particular was pretty good, which is why everybody tried to emulate it. Now,
yeah.
that's a recollection of a teenager from 20 years later, so don't hold me to it. I have not read it since then, and I might pick it up. If I picked it up today, I might say, wow, I can't stand this at all.
Yeah,
Um,
the movie I myself will vouch for it. And the thing is, like the pretty thing, like it the way she did it worked really well, because if you look at the structure of the story, and as we talked about earlier about vampire mythology, while as Brian, I actually talked about this in an interview with him and some other things, because his vampires in is Caucus. I don't know if you read that short story of his. It's very very different. Um,
who are we
and
talking about again?
uh, is Caucus his short story?
Who?
Brian
Which
Nehemiah?
which author? No, I wasn't aware it existed.
Yeah, it's actually, if you go to his website, it's available for free on his website.
Okay.
So it's essentially like his free sample to get you hooked, and
Okay.
nothing else continues with it. It's a standalone short story, but I think it's just to get you hooked on his writing.
Mhm.
Anyway, I actually reviewed it on my blog. It's good. It's a good short story. I recommend it. It's not a big investment in time, and it's interesting. He was going back more to the earlier vampire roots, where they're very very
Mhm.
degenerate. Obviously, Anne Rice's vampires, by way of being beautiful, were not nearly as degenerate. Beautiful and articulate, were not nearly as degenerate, although they served a very
And
very good
and
purpose.
and yet, in certain ways, they were more degenerate. If you look into the stories, and that's actually one of the things that was interesting, is that they were beautiful and interesting and thoroughly rotten
Yes,
underneath it all.
yeah, and
Anyway,
that's
I'm
actually
I'm
the
sidetracking you, but
no, but it really fits in with the well, it's not in direct keeping with the vampire lore that Brian was trying to get back to in his story, where the
right.
vampires are much more like corpses that kind of get up and walk around on occasion.
Mhm.
Like you meet them as corpses, and they stink, and they're awful, and just utterly terrible, in the sense of like inspiring terror. The Anne Rice's are seductive in a sense, because in the movie at least they're completely asexual.
Right.
Other people perceive them in a sort of sexual way, but they
Right.
themselves are completely asexual. Um, so in that within the movie, like you have that aspect, there's the mockery of the natural there, which is properly within properly Christian. Moreover, um, not only do you have that mockery of the natural, but um, you have very much they live in the darkness. They
Right.
will burn in utterly disintegrate in sunlight, and moreover, they live in the darkness in that metaphorical sense that they only come out at night, and only in dim candlelight, where you can't really see how pale they are.
Right.
Do they look pretty? And only at night, when people are drunk and then up late and so on, does this work. And so it really does actually fit into that metaphor of these are people who live not as men live, but who live, they live preying on human beings, and moreover they do so live you know only in the darkness, only where lies can pass as truth. And it's actually a great theme they have, of the main
It
vampire.
is, and my recollection of the book is similar. The part that really sticks with me 20 years later is the character that was played by Kirsten Dunst in the film,
Hmm.
the child vampire. And my recollection is that the book hit on this more than the movie did, and for good reason if you think about it, because well, I'll get to that in a second, but um, the the character is one. In the book, she's a several hundred-year-old vampire
Mm.
trapped in the body of a little girl,
Mm.
and
Yeah, the
it's
movie changed that
it's
radically.
it's disturbing in ways that might seem to be disturbing, but that's also part of the point. It's meant to be disturbing, unlike a lot of modern stuff where you would see something like that and it's meant to be maybe a little shocking and then try to normalize it some. It was meant to be disturbing, and it was meant to make you kind of,
These are
to
wrong. There's something
these
wrong
are
with them.
wrong. There's something wrong here, and her relationships were wrong, and it was, everything was off on that because she couldn't relate even to the other vampires because they saw her as a child. Even the vampires that she sired as vampires, they saw her as a child and interacted with her that way. Um, and there was definitely, I can't remember if the vampires were asexual in the book or not, but there was definitely sexual tension related to this as well because of the whole vampire sexuality metaphors that are always there. And that's the reason they backed off of it so much in the film, because it worked in the book, but I'm dead convinced that if you'd shown that on film, it would have been too much.
Yeah, probably.
um,
Yeah.
it just would have been too much for people to like. No, when you see it visually, it's just wrong, and
Yeah.
it's creepy anyway in the book. But it's like when you're not seeing it, you can kind of distance yourself from it and get the metaphor. And in the film, that just doesn't that part didn't come across the same way.
Mm. There's another thing
Um,
too about a book versus a film. The film has actors, the book doesn't.
right,
And whatever you
and
do in a film, you have to actually put the
that's
actors through.
right. And that's a young girl that you're going to have to run through this in a film where you're already, running a young girl through some stuff that's iffy on what you should be running a girl that age through.
Yeah.
So I don't criticize them for taking that out. I absolutely think they made the right call. But it's an area where the film actually lost something from the book. Because that's the part that really stands out at me 20 years later is how horrible it would be
Mm.
to be trapped for hundreds of years in a child's body.
Mm.
Um, that's that's really horrifying to think about it.
It
And it's the
is.
dark side of immortality, and it's the immortality as a mockery of the true resurrection. So even though it was written by an atheist at the time and was not meant to be in any way a Christian book, and in many ways isn't, it still conveys some of that conventional Christian morality. I find it very interesting that the author has since converted to very evangelical Christianity and has completely disavowed all of her writing in that period.
Yeah. Yeah, she didn't have to when she was Catholic, but as an evangelical did have to. The and there's a really great, the metaphor of light and the dark. One of the things, and probably the thing that struck me most was when Louis the vampire, um, uh, as he's narrating this, and he's talking about how the thing that he missed, when he said yes to becoming a vampire, that he said goodbye to the light.
Right.
And then later on, there's a wonderful, wonderful scene where he's talking about when he was going to Europe and arriving at the Mediterranean, and he said how I longed for the waters to be blue, but they were black, the black of the sea at night. And
Right.
and he mentioned one of the things that he lost was blue. Just never
Mhm.
saw any intense blue anymore. It's something you take for granted in the day, like the blue sky, blue waters. But as a vampire, it was no longer available. And so there was that really hit home on that theme of how in becoming a vampire, there's just a large section of the world that was no longer available to him, that he'd
Right.
stepped out of the light into this very contracted, narrow world, which again is that very, very Christian theme of the vampire of
And
having.
right. And so in those early days of this current generation of vampires, you still had a lot of that. But now the movement's kicked off into the romantic vampires, where it's degenerated to the point of Twilight, which I happen to agree with the review that Daddy Warpig left, Jason Jones left of Twilight, where he talks about, look, for what it is, which really what it is a romance story. It's a paranormal romance, not an actual um, urban fantasy novel, a vampire novel. It's a paranormal romance, and for what it is, it's an excellent example of that. But at the same time, it is also an end point of a degeneration of the vampire mythology from really being that metaphor that we've talked about to being honestly sparkly fairies in that book. It's just that we just call them vampires. um,
Yeah, I mean, well, there's one thing about it because I actually read slightly over half of Twilight with a friend. Actually, my friend Michael. We actually literally we had to help each other through it. We took turns reading it to each other because that's the only way we could power our way through this thing. And we played a game where we'd occasionally insert sentences. And so the other one had to spot the inserted sentences, and half the time we'd get it right, and half the time we'd be we got a lot of false positives. Like it's not really in there, is it? Yeah, it is. See, look here. Yeah. I mean, and this is how bad Twilight is. My friend, and we did this a number of years ago. So we've been good friends for 15 years, and we'd have to show each other the proof in the book that we weren't lying, despite the fact good friends for 15 years, and we'd have to prove it to each other. That's how bad some of the sentences were. That said, Twilight does have a very unusual premise, which is somewhat does rely on the vampire thing, which is, in a nutshell, what if you were fell desperately in love with somebody who desperately wanted to kill you, but thought they shouldn't?
Right. And it's intriguing, but the real core of it, the real core of its success has nothing to do with that either. Well, and the reason you're struggling with it like that is because you're not the core audience that it's intended for. Which, by the way, you really don't do yourself any favors when you're trying to say that you read that with another man. I'm just saying. No, just kidding aside, though, the real genre it's in romance, which boils down to a very simple trope. This is the core.
The world wants me.
Well, no, it's a little bit more than that, and this is the core of every romance novel that's out there. And at the risk of insulting the huge number of readers out there who read it, it's porn for women. It's porn for women. It hits them the same way that visual porn hits men. It's women are wired differently than men are, and they react to this. And it's hitting a very visceral, very formulaic female fantasy that lies in there, which is the two most desirable men that I could possibly dream up are interested in me, and I have to choose between them. That's the fantasy. Notice the core of every romance story is always the trio. There's the two major alpha males and the generally very bland female. And it's bland on purpose so that any woman who's reading it can insert herself into that role and then go through I have to choose between these two amazing men. And to show you how much this is very specifically female targeted, have you ever seen the film Serendipity with John Cusack? And I can't remember. I think Kate Beckinsale may be one of the female leads.
It's relatively recent then. No, I haven't.
It's at least it's early 2000s. It's not old, but it's before she was big. It's maybe late 90s, because I remember having a discussion about it with my wife before we got married. So it's more than 10 years old. It's out there. It's not really a very good film. It bombed despite, having a strong cast and a good marketing campaign. And the reason it bombed is because what they tried to do was take the typical female romance story and flip it. They had a guy who was about to get married to this really great girl. And then he met this other really great girl. And the whole movie is him having to choose between these two really great girls. And it doesn't work when you flip it. It doesn't work at all. You're making the face that I made as I watched this film. Like, that girl you're marrying is like great. What's the problem?
That's casting the central. I mean, that's casting the guy as somebody. By the time you're engaged, you have promised to marry somebody. That is casting the central guy as a man who doesn't keep his word.
It doesn't work when you do it as a man
Which
at all.
amongst other
And,
things, no man wants to slot himself into that.
no, and the guy comes across as basically a jerk. He comes across as very unrelatable.
Here's somebody who's
And
indecisive, doesn't keep his word, will have people like arrange their lives
right.
around him and then be willing to let them down. Yep, that's me.
And the other reason it doesn't work is because it doesn't fit the male version of the fantasy. Because the male version of the fantasy is not, look, I have two beautiful women, I have to choose between them. The male version of the fantasy is, I have two great beautiful women, how can I have them both?
Yeah.
This is the male
Or,
version of the fantasy. So it's
or something you can do in more general company is just one beautiful woman, and how do you win her?
right.
People
So
watch that story in droves.
but when you flip this around and make it women, that's the story, and it doesn't appeal to us men at all, because we don't have the biological instinct to really connect with this story. So when you flip it to the men, it doesn't work at any level. It doesn't work. The men don't like this because you're watching it like, it just doesn't work for. It didn't work for me when it was women. It certainly doesn't work for me now. And the women watch it and they're like, this guy's not appealing at all. What's up with this? And so the movie bombed pretty bad, and it goes from that. And when you actually watch it, it's not a terrible movie, but it just doesn't work at the end of the day. It doesn't hit any of the emotional responses for that. But the female version of the story, the female centric version, literally hits women the same way that visual porn hits men. And it's erotic to most women, literally, and that's why the story doesn't work for me and you, because we're not hit by it that way. It's the same way as trying to, your typical woman watching porn has a looks at it the same way that we look at romance novels. We're like, that I don't even get the appeal.
Yeah, the story's pretty bad right here. The funny thing, there's one asterisk to this. There's one romance novel, not counting Twilight, I actually read, which was attempting to find comedic material. I'd entertained a group of my friends one time because somebody had for some reason, I don't remember or may not have known, bought a women's magazine. Most of the friends were female, and someone had bought a women's magazine. I don't know why, and it had a romance short story in it. Mm-hmm. Which I then read in as dramatic and serious a fashion as I possibly could. Mm-hmm. And they're really funny when you do that. Like read out loud and reading it very dramatically, as if this is not porn, but rather this is like an actual real story where the story is what matters. And I had people who I mean, they were cracking up. They were laughing tremendously. I like to make people laugh. So I actually went and bought the first I went to like a used bookstore or something like that and bought like the first romance novel I could find, because there's no way I'm buying a women's magazine. And then I started, reading through it, trying to find, like what would be the especially funny passages to read next time I've got this opportunity to read to this group of friends. It never ended up doing it because what I realized later is that it just doesn't have the same density. Like being a novel is just way slower than the short story. So it had the wrong density for being amusing. It wasn't actually a terrible story, curiously enough. And I don't think it quite fit the two. I don't. Actually, come to think of it, I think there might have been a second man. I didn't pay much attention to that part. It was set in the West, Western and stuff. And it wasn't unreadable. It was much more readable than Twilight. But it did have the one thing I do remember, which was the line where somebody had, I think, overly used their thesaurus. He cupped her gently rotating femininity.
The thing is, though, that people make a huge mistake when they talk about how badly written a romance novel is. Well, that's like talking about how badly acted a porn film is. Nobody cares. That's not the point. that's not why people are getting it. It's just not that. The other thing about Twilight is I will, even with what I just said, I'll make a slight correction about it. People talk about it being poorly written. In reality, it's very simply written. It's written to a lowest common denominator audience, which is one of the reasons it found such mass appeal. The people like us who are highly educated and actually writers, and heavy readers forget how uncommon that is actually in the modern era now. The average adult American reads less than one novel a year. And that's an average. Realize that average is heavily skewed by people like Vox Day, who read upwards of 100 novels a year. So what you have in reality is you have a small group of people reading a ton of novels a year and the vast majority reading none. And part of that is because the average adult American, their speaking vocabulary is at an 8th grade level. This is one of the reasons Trump was so successful on the campaign platform. Love him or hate him. Everybody talks about how stupid he sounds. It's deliberate. It takes work to talk down to that level. He speaks at an 8th grade level. It's been tracked by people, they've done that. He speaks at an 8th grade level. He speaks at an 8th grade level because he's been a salesman his whole career, and he knows that's what people understand. He's talking to the masses on purpose. The average person speaks, Chris, not reads, but speaks at an 8th grade level. Now, most people read at a lower level than what they speak. So imagine the average American speaks at an 8th grade level. Imagine their reading level. So what Twilight is it's the novel version of Trump's speeches. It's written at a level that the average soccer mom can actually read. So to people like you and me, we look at this and we're like, what is this Dick and Jane novel that's going around here?
That's an excellent point. And I contradict absolutely none of what you said. The things I objected to most, well, actually really were structure, frankly, but like it was the parts where they were like astonishingly repetitive. Like there were the things that stand out were when she talked about how utterly beautiful the vampires were, and she talked about how utterly beautiful the vampires were in this incredibly repetitive way, where it was just this extremely superlative laden repetitive sort of thing where essentially she just like took a big trowelful and slapped it on. And I do understand that if you don't, that repetition is to some degree necessary if you're not going to vary your vocabulary. So I will.
It's not even just that though. It's and this is a lesson that years of teaching has taught me. There's an old saying. I've seen people actually get up to give a presentation and a lecture and actually lead with this, which I look at and I'm like, I don't lead with that. But there's an old saying that if you want somebody to remember what you're saying when you're teaching it, you have to say it 3 times. And I've seen the guy get up there and he says, well, the saying is you got to say it 3 times to get people to remember it. So I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. Then I'm going to tell you. Then I'm going to tell you what I told you. I've literally heard a guy get up and start a presentation with that. And then he goes through and he's like, all right, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. And he gives you a summary. And like, okay, now I'm going to tell. So you're embarrassing yourself. But the fact he was embarrassing himself by presenting it this way, but the fact that he's talking about is literally true. For the vast majority of the people, in order for them to retain what you're telling them, you have to say it 3 times.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, there's even useful about like,
and so again, the repetition is a common pattern when you're speaking or writing down to a certain level. And again, it's a pattern you'll see in Trump's speeches too, that everybody makes fun of him for, exactly the way you are right now. But what it is an effective communication technique. I can't bear to write that way, so I don't, which means that my books will not be as accessible to as large of an audience. I'm not writing for as large as an audience is not what I'm going after. But that's part of what's been done. And it is part of, frankly, a literal dumbing down of our society. Our literacy rates have gotten to the point where if you want to sell that many books, you have to dumb it down that way. Because the majority of Americans literally cannot read something written at a higher level than that. They literally can't, even if they wanted to. And so that's what she's done. Now, how intentional that was versus that's just the level she writes at, I couldn't tell you.
Given
One other
some
thing.
elements of her plot, it's very, very plausible that it was more the latter than the former. My actual biggest complaint of Twilight, by the way, was that you know that whole like bland character that can be slotted in, where
Yep.
anyone can slide. You know how there's also, I think, something of a trope of that sort of character often having like being a little clumsy.
Mm-hmm.
Bella Swan took that to this is a cliche, but a whole new level. In that she managed to, in badminton, in one swing, hit both herself and somebody else. Now, that is a level of clumsiness. Given that a badminton racket has no momentum, mind you, because the thing weighs like, 2 ounces, how you hit somebody and keep on going until you hit yourself is pretty much impossible. Even worse.
You've clearly never met my mother-in-law, who I'm fairly certain could pull off that technique.
Maybe, but okay, it gets worse though. That one just kind of was on the iffy side. There's a scene where where Bella walked into the wrong neighborhood in some city nearby, and there was like a gang of men who were starting to threaten her, and so she stood her ground to fight, because if on this level paved road she were to try to run away, she would guaranteedly trip and then become easy prey. This woman could not run down a street reliably. In fact, there's a scene when she was essentially asking the vampire, like, why are you so protective? And he took her hand, turned it over, and showed her the wounds that she had from when she was running and kept tripping over and over and over again. I kid you not, because there's a scene where she was very, very mildly lost in the woods and was like running, and she kept falling down over and over and like skinned her knees and skinned the palms of her hands running through the forest.
I absolutely agree with you. I have not read the book. I have seen the movies. I've read bits of the book. I watched the movies with my wife. Gonna embarrass my wife for a second. Pro tip, guys: just shut up about the movie, go watch it, come home and have fun later, okay? The thing about that, though, is, again, look at the audience that it's actually intended for, and many of them may not actually be that clumsy, but they feel that way. And if I can say this in the nicest way possible, because I don't mean it judgmentally, although many will take it that way, to a degree, the clumsiness is a metaphor for being fat. Because most of the readers who are reading it, look at the readership base for that. It's a bunch of middle-aged women, with the characteristics that come with being a middle-aged soccer mom. I've had multiple children and my body reflects it. And they feel like that in their heads, going around. So it's a trope that connects the character to the readers, which is, again, the whole point of that character. Is for the reader to insert herself into that character in the story and view it that way. So it's a technique that's done for that. Now, to me and you, that makes no sense because we're somewhat coordinated. I mean, I know to me, it takes a certain degree of coordination to get out and teach a martial arts class. It takes a certain amount of coordination to pull an 80-pound bow and actually hit a deer with it.
From a tree stand up in a tree that right. You don't fall out of. Yeah.
Yeah. And so if you can manage those feats, the idea of tripping over your own 2 feet running away from an attacker seems ludicrous.
Guarantee, as a risk, okay, fine. I know that I will certainly trip and fall down and be easy prey, so I'm better off just standing here and trying to punch them than I am running to the 2 blocks over where there are lots of people who could probably almost hear me scream from right here.
It's not meant to be logical. It's meant to be an emotional reaction, though, that fits in. So again, it doesn't make sense to you and me because
Yeah,
we're
no,
looking at it that logically.
that's true. I mean, my friend Michael actually mentioned because he had
Hey, I've got a baby screaming. I'm gonna have to interrupt you for just a second. I'm sorry.
no problem.
Sorry, Morgan's already gone to bed.
Yeah, no problem. No, I know how that goes. Believe me, I know how that goes.
And she's still screaming. Hold on just a second. Okay, she's calmed back down. I'm not going in if she's gotten quiet.
I know that one too very well. Yeah, my friend Michael, who had actually before his current occupation, actually worked taking care of the mentally disabled. Like the
Mm-hmm.
profoundly retarded and so on. He said, I've worked with people like that, but they're supposed to have padded helmets and stuff on because they don't, otherwise they always have these, large sores they're constantly reopening as they crash into everything and they suffer brain
Oh,
damage over time. It's like, and you say, like, it's very recognizable. I mean, I've seen that. I've worked with people like that, but where's their crash helmet? And who's taking care of her? And, but so it's funny because it's funny to me, and I get what you're saying, and I actually find very interesting the clumsy as metaphor for fat, because she's got to be a beautiful teenager, and so
right.
how do
And
you bring that in? It's very
you
interesting, your suggestion.
you you don't want to just you don't want to make your readers feel bad by calling it out. And it's also look,
Well, it would break the fantasy.
it's not believable that this vampire would be interested in her if she weren't beautiful, right?
Yeah.
It's not believable. So you've got to get it in there. So the clumsy is a metaphor, and it's a metaphor because when you are heavy and overweight, you tend to become clumsy along with it. Um, and that part is played up because then it actually leaves the reader feeling better. Well, I'm not that clumsy. So
Well,
um
that's perfectly true. I mean, but
and
I mean,
and it
nobody who is lives nobody who lives without a literal caretaker is that clumsy. But that's
I you
it's
know I wish I could show you a video of my aunt, of Morgan's aunt falling down the stairs a couple years ago. If we had that, we would have won America's Funniest Videos if we had video of it. And it would contradict your statement that they don't live free. It's if you're listening, Leo, which I'm sure you're not, we love you. Um, but
yeah.
it's there are people who are pretty darn clumsy out there.
No, that's true. I mean, not. not usually in the constantly suffering, like not in the routinely bleeding profusely sort of sense. I mean, there are
That,
people who bleed from time to time, but like every day, like bleeding profusely because you just can't keep your blood on the inside of your skin.
um, I think they're less common, obviously, but I've actually met a few
Oh,
that are actually, they walk around with the sores. You can see where they've bruised themselves and everything from it.
fair
Um,
enough. People are more durable than we tend to give them credit for.
yeah. Now, the other comment that I will make is that to be that bad, it usually comes along with other issues. Substance abuse is one of them. Um, but
Well,
it's
I
not
guess
always
I was
there with
thinking
that.
in a perfectly
But
healthy person.
yeah,
You know.
but I see that with people who have legitimate mental issues, though, that aren't locked up. And things that are routine these days that we medicate people for instead to
Mhm. Well, I didn't
varying
mean
degrees
locked
of
up.
non-effect.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't mean locked up when I said with the caretaker. Very often, somebody who looks after
Yeah.
them, relative, somebody like
Um,
that who checks in every day to make sure that they're not getting themselves killed that day. That's all
um,
I meant. But that said, getting back to the more
yeah.
literary side of this, um, you know, the clumsiest metaphor for fat is very interesting too, in that being very clumsy sort of puts you outside of normal. There are things you can't do, like you'll
Yes.
never dance, for example.
Mhm.
You'll never partner dance. Um, Although I haven't gotten much of a chance lately. I'm very into Lindy Hop, which is
Mhm.
a partner swing dance, and it takes a lot of coordination. And if you
Right.
are really, really clumsy, you're never going to try something
No.
like that. You're never going to do it. You're never going to pull it off. There are, most people don't actually partner dance in a. Well, actually, you're far enough south. Maybe people do. Partner dancing, like square
It's
dancing.
not common. It's not
Okay,
common here.
I know there's
I know
some maybe further south.
there's folks who do it in classes and stuff and clubs, but it's not common anymore, even here.
Oh, okay, because I
Um,
was talking with somebody who I think is further west, like more in Texas, where
mhm.
they were saying like this actually is a normal thing that like everybody does and goes out to, and I think it was square dance, line dance, something like that, um, where it actually was like in not in big cities, but like it was actually still a living part of the culture. Um,
Mhm.
anyway, be that as it may, you're excluded from these sort of things if you are very clumsy, and that has a similar effect to the way that being fat tends to put you more
Yep,
on the outside.
absolutely.
So it's
The,
very interesting. There's that structural similarity, which makes the one a good slot in for the other.
the other thing it does from a structural standpoint, story wise, is it provides a huge contrast for when at the end of the series she later becomes a vampire herself. Um,
Mm,
which, if you've only read the first half of the first book, you might not have known that's how the series ends.
I
Um,
heard it. They're not
and
spoilers
but
flying around, but
it provides a contrast, which as a writer, you need to have from the beginning of how the
yeah,
character starts to how the character ends. Um, and a rather extreme one because once she becomes a vampire, of course she's sparkly and beautiful and perfectly coordinated as well, like all
that's
of the
funny
other
because my friend
vampires. So
Michael and I speculated because we knew that we were aware she became a vampire, and that being a vampire massively exaggerates your traits, so that the person who was stubborn before they became a vampire became like hyper stubborn as a vampire. Um, and so we were speculating that she got so clumsy as a vampire that she'd literally just be like bouncing off the walls and floors where gravity didn't even apply to her anymore. So that's not what happened.
that's not my recollection of it. I may not have actually seen the final film. Now that I'm thinking about this in my head, but my wife Morgan's talked about it a bit. She's read the books and seen the films.
I believe you that in fact she did not become so hyper clumsy that gravity no
I
longer
don't think
applied.
that's what they went for. In fact, I'm fairly certain it went for the oh hey look, now I'm a vampire and I'm beautiful happily ever after with these other fairy friends of mine. Which because look, it had to have, because that's the fantasy,
Yeah,
right? And that's what the books are really all about. Yeah, you and I are not writing that kind of book. So if we were writing that kind of book, that's what we would do. She would become a vampire and it would accentuate this clumsiness and it would be comically hysterical. But it would appeal to our guy friends who would also be laughing, at this, and it would not have the same sort of mass female swooning effect that the books actually have. So it's again, the books are not written for you and me.
No,
And
no.
this is something as a writer that I've really come, as a writer and as a businessman and as a publisher, that I've really come to understand in the last few months. Even it's been a bit of a revelation to me, is how much people really stick within what they like.
Mm.
Um, Not just in genre, but really down to subgenre. Like, people like this is what I like, and that's what they read.
Yeah.
And
I think a lot of it comes down to trust.
it does, but trust is a good example, because like I'm reading within a certain subgenre. I have a pretty high degree of trust that I know what I'm going to get out of this story. And my wife Morgan and I were talking about this recently too, and we realized that even though we both have very eclectic taste, um, we read a lot of different subgenres and genres, and a lot of weird combinations. And even within that, we don't stray very far outside of what we like to read. Even it's just
Yeah.
a wider array than most people have, and it may be a stranger array than most people have. But but we don't stray outside of it very much. And we realized, I've talked with several other authors and publishers, and really figuring that out has actually helped our book sales considerably since we figured that out. Like, it's gotten, if you're advertising your book outside of the particular subgenre that it's in, you are probably wasting money.
Mm.
Those people aren't going to read it. And what we've really figured out is you need to make sure you give a very clear indication of, this is the kind of book you're getting, to the readers, because then what you do is it's pairing you up with the actual people who actually might want to pick up your book and give it a chance.
Yeah.
And it's letting them know that this is the kind of book, if you like this kind of book, that's what you're getting. And that was part of the impetus behind the recent title change and cover change with my own upcoming novel. Was, okay, we really need to symbolize that this book is within this particular genre and what it's like, and send that signal to our potential readers.
Yeah, which is very valuable to the reader as well. I
It
mean,
is.
clear communication benefits everyone, basically.
Well, and I had this discussion with somebody on Facebook about 2 or 3 months ago, is that the genre classifications weren't invented by writers. They were invented by booksellers. And it's a tool to help pair readers with the right books, is really what it is. It's a tool to help them find the books that they want. And so that's a very valuable thing. And one other thing, from talking to several other authors who have written quite a bit more than I have, is also finding out that even though the readers really like to trust authors and follow authors, most of them won't follow you into a new genre.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's something I've, from a business standpoint, I have the novels I've done so far, have been, if I was setting out to make bad decisions, I wouldn't have had to do anything differently, which is okay. Like
it's what learning is all about, right?
Exactly. And moreover, like I wrote stories that I liked to write, and I am very happy with the first few, because the first few are very much a learning experience. I took this very much like, the first few are not going to do well. I never expected them to do well, and learned a lot from doing them. So they worked there. I like, there were stories that I like to write, and and it has the property of, like, they are stories that could eventually find a reasonable audience. They won't be a giant audience, but they could eventually find a reasonable audience. Through the luck of, eventually, as more people get to know me, some people will like both genres. The first two just don't really sit well in any genre. It's one reason why I'm a big mystery fan, and as I move in that direction, I actually have to publish my mystery. Literally, it's 99.9% done. It's completely edited and stuff. I'm just the last little bit of the actual mechanics of pushing it out has to actually happen. I've just been dragging my feet for various important reasons, and and that's something I've been looking at. That my murder mystery is very solidly within the murder mystery genre,
right?
And so it's something where if you look at it, it will look like the sort of thing that if you like to read murder mysteries, well, this is very much the sort of thing you would expect it to be. So I mean, from that perspective, it sits much more comfortably there. And but bringing to what you said, there are people where I will read their nonfiction books that I for whatever reason, I don't have any inclination whatever to follow them to their fiction books. There are people where in one genre so I just would have no inclination myself to follow them. It wouldn't. I'm very iffy that this would in fact work. I mean, it could be good, but I'm just really iffy. And so turning that around, I wouldn't expect a reader to follow me across genres.
No, and it's not what they do. And the flip side of that is that the part that makes it relevant to our current conversation is that there are a lot of people like us who look at those particular books from outside the genre, people who really just we're not fans of the genre, right? And we look at it and we're like, well, that's stupid. Why would you do that? But realize all the people who are fans of that book are looking right back at our genres saying, well, that's stupid. Why would you do that?
No, I've seen that. I've never understood people who don't understand murder mysteries, but I've seen that. I've witnessed with my own eyes and heard why do you find it fun to kill people off? The fun part is catching the people who did. And represent that as as a good example of what you're saying. Now Twilight's kind of interesting in that I didn't quite realize, sort of when I got into it, I didn't really, because I didn't think of it as a romance novel because it was popular among teens,
right?
And that's what I most associated with. And I actually one time by a random thing during NaNoWriMo at a meetup I went to, there were these young teenage girls, 13, 14, who for some reason had struck up conversations with people in the group, and so one of them actually, I don't know, somehow came up about Twilight, and so here was my opportunity to actually talk to a 14-year-old girl about Twilight. How often does that come up in life if you don't happen to have one as a daughter or niece that you hang out with a lot? And so I actually asked her about some of the themes in Twilight. The sparkly vampire talks about how he's damned, but his life seems actually pretty good. Do you really think he is damned, and if so, in what sense? And some questions like that. And what was interesting is she told me about wow, it's a really good question. I've thought a lot about this. And she told me how much she thought about it. She never gave me an answer.
First of all, congratulations on having that conversation with a 14-year-old girl and not getting arrested.
I was there, and then she showed up. And this was in part of a group. So it was one of those rare contexts where because normally nothing like that would ever happen. I never, it would never go near them, but I didn't. They came near me.
Secondly, I'm just harassing you, man. Secondly, I don't know what kind of answer you expected from a 14-year-old girl.
I didn't. For the first, just to clarify, I did not expect an answer. I was just really curious. This is ad experimentum. Right. What sort of answer would I actually get? It was kind of curious because the answer that I got was about how much she had thought about this.
Yeah, which actually doesn't surprise me at all.
It wasn't shocking.
The characters involved,
but it was fascinating to actually do the experiment and get actual data back.
Yeah,
I really thought about this a lot. And, I mean, I really put a lot of thought. It's a really interesting subject. Basically, she just told me about how great she was and never said anything about the topic.
Right.
Which is shocking, but
which is kind of what the books are for. It's their purpose. It's the actual purpose that they serve. Um, it is. It's a book that's designed to extract a certain kind of emotional response from a certain kind of audience, and part of that response is to make them feel good about themselves.
Mm.
And which is the response you're getting. It's the response is not about the actual question. The response is about her and how good she feels for having thought about this so much. It's designed for that. It's the book does not hold up under any sort of thought, right? But it's not designed to. Again, realize
Yeah.
it's porn for women. If you watch the average porn movie, it doesn't hold up to any kind of thought. It's not its purpose. It's not what it's for. To go truly sacrilegious for a moment and really get off the rails. I remember this wonderful video by Bishop Robert Barron before he became a bishop, where he was talking about critiquing the Bible, and that the modern tendency is to critique the Bible and point out every single factual error in it. And his point was, look, it's not a science text. And you're trying to critique it as if it's a science text. And in fact, you're trying to critique it as if it's all in one genre, when in fact the Bible is full of dozens of genres, including the genre we call the Gospels, which are a completely unique genre in pretty much all of Western literature.
Anything anybody's written down anywhere, basically.
Right. It's so treating it on those terms is a category error. It's a you're not even really looking at the problem the right way. And the same, in fact, is really true of Twilight. If you're trying to look at it as, look, this writing breaks down and it doesn't make sense, you're committing a category error. That's not what the book is intended to do. It's not what it's supposed to do. So you're right. People like us we're never going to be fans of that book. And another example to get us completely shifted to a different topic altogether. Another name I've mentioned earlier in the show, Daddy Warpig, Jason Jones, wrote a review of Ready Player One recently. I don't know if you've read the book yourself. And he makes some very valid points about the book. It's basically a giant 1980s pop culture nostalgia wankfest. Is the book. If you happen to be in the right target demographic for that book, it's pretty amazing. I happen to have been right in that middle target demographic, and I read the book and I'm looking at it, I'm like, this is great. And when I finished it, my wife was looking at it, she's like, oh, you really love that book. It's like, is it great? And I'm like, yeah, I really loved it. You probably wouldn't. She's 10 years younger than I am. I'm a child of the 80s. She's a child of the 90s. And, the nostalgia, she wouldn't even get half the references in it.
Yeah.
It's so
there's lots that you had to be there for.
There is a lot you had to be there for. Like, I could explain it's like a joke. If you have to explain it, it's not funny. And the references are all the same way. If you have to explain it, it's not cool anymore.
Well, nostalgic references, just structurally speaking, are even more profound than jokes. Because occasionally, I've had jokes explained to me that were then funny. I've explained jokes to people on occasion that were then funny. Nostalgia never works that way, because we're all talking about formative experiences.
Right.
And you haven't been formed by those experiences that can't resonate with you.
Yeah, you really had to be there. So, and that's a case where, again, we both really loved the show, but we had very different reactions to Stranger Things. It's a period piece set in the 80s. So I watched it about a bunch of kids set in the 80s. So I watched it and I'm like, holy cow, that's what my childhood was like. Like, they nailed it. And she's just like, oh, that's interesting. That's nothing like what my childhood was like. And
Yeah.
again, but in this case, in that the case of that show, that's not what made the show great. It's just that setting it as a period piece was a good decision for the story they were telling.
It's very
Ready
often a
Player
good
One.
decision.
Ready Player One was it's meant to be a nostalgia trip. That's really what it's written for, and for the audience who's into that, it's very effective. And for everybody else, it's a good God, this book is stupid
Yeah.
kind of thing.
What,
And it is. It's a
what's
plot that breaks down badly. It's got major plot holes, but if you're caught up in the nostalgia factor, you're like, oh hey, like that, yeah, this is great reference, and it works for some people. Not for it worked enough to make it a massively successful book.
yeah. Well, what was that
But
crowdfunded movie, Kung Fu? Where he went back in time and Kung Fu'd Hitler.
I don't know that one.
Oh, it's a short rather than a full movie. It was, um, uh, I can't believe I can't think of it. You didn't see that one. It's just a few years ago. There's a guy. Um, well, yeah, he Kung Fury is I think the name of it. Anyway,
Don't know it.
It is very, very, very much an 80s nostalgia bomb.
Right.
Very, very much about certain types of movies. And yeah, I mean, there's really, I mean, wildly wild. I mean, the top is miles and miles below it as it sailed over. But again, it had that same property. It seemed to take the entire internet by storm for a few months back when. So I was just guessing. But an interesting thing about genre and misgenreing, because your point was a good one. There's a very interesting relationship too between genre and cliche.
Yes.
Or formulaic. There's a while ago I remember seeing John C. Wright talk about formulaic writing, and he had mentioned something about writing to a formula just seeming like an odd way of describing a workman-like job. But the interesting thing, or the thing that really struck me as interesting, is that what is the difference between something being formulaic and something being in a genre? And a lot of it is that, like if you were to take, if you were to take murder mysteries as being not in the murder mystery genre, but in the drama genre, then they're really formulaic because there's always a dead body.
Mm-hmm.
The writers always do it the same way. But if you take it as a genre, that's just one of the rules. And the place where you're looking for originality is someplace else because the rules are the bones of the story that give it a structure for you. And so whether something's formulaic or genre is attitude, largely.
There's that. And again, a genre is, in a certain ways, it's a contract with the reader. So it says, hey, I'm in this genre. There's this set of things that I'm going to give you as a reader that you can expect. And so to some degree, you're right. The place for originality is outside of that contract. The other point, I made this point on our own podcast again over the weekend, is you can actually break the rules of a genre and get away with it. But the catch is, if I break one rule, then I need to make sure that I really stick hard to some of the other rules. And the bigger of a break I make, the more I have to stick to the other rules to convince my readers that, yes, I'm still in your genre. I'm just doing something different with it. So I think you can get away with that if you really stick hard to a lot of the other rules.
Another way to phrase that would be you can break a rule of the genre as long as you do it lovingly.
That too, you can definitely do that as well. Like and if you treat it right and you have the, hey, look, I'm not not talking about your rule being bad. I'm just gonna do something a little different in this spot. And that's one way to shake up the formula. Even within a genre, the formula gets tired sometimes. You have readers who are like, okay, I've read a million books in this genre. I'm ready for a break. And then they see that one that's a little different, and they're like, oh man, this was really good. Well, outside of that genre, it may not have even been particularly original. But within that genre, you have somebody who's like, okay, I'm following your genre rules, but I'm going to break this one over here, and just so I can give you something. Because honestly, what readers and movie watchers and story listeners in any sense, what they ultimately really want is something that's familiar, but not too familiar. And, maybe a little bit new, but not too new. It needs to have enough familiarity that they feel comfortable with it, but enough new and novel that it's not just the same old, and they're bored with it.
Yeah, it can't be predictable. It,
Right.
it needs to be reliable, but not predictable.
Right. And
That's the odd balance you have to try.
so the formulas that people talk about a lot of times, those are a great way to give the bones, as you say, the reliable, that gives the reader enough that they can follow your story and feel comfortable with it.
And very often save you a tremendous amount of exposition.
Yes. Yes, it can save you a lot of work, because if the readers already expect certain things. I had one discussion with one of my beta readers for War Demons. She she's actually also another author, and she sent some stuff back to me and some notes. And one particular thing is there's a dragon in the book, and of course, as a writer, you don't want to just use the same word all the time for everything. So there's one point in the story I've been calling it dragon, I just threw in, I'm going to use the word worm, WYRM, and she sends me back a note on it. It's like, why are you introducing new vocabulary here? What's this thing with a worm? I had to figure out what that meant and everything. And, you should consider changing this. And I'm like, the audience I'm targeting this book for is going to absolutely know that a worm is a dragon. I mean, I'm not going to rewrite the book to put this in and change it, because, the target audience in an urban fantasy novel, or any kind of fantasy novel, the vast majority of readers are going to well know that this is a similar, I think she made a similar comment when I used the word Drake at one point too. And I'm like, look, trust me, my audience knows this. And she's also straight up admitting, when she sent me back some of her comments, that she's like, I really liked it. I'm not a fan of, I'm not a genre reader in this genre, but I really liked the book anyway. But she's sending back notes like this because she doesn't catch the genre. But again, sticking to the genre trope, because if I'm marketing it as that genre, I don't have to go back in and put the explanation in, or limit my vocabulary to the word dragon, which basically everybody knows. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, take a lot of classic adventure stuff. I've been watching a lot of kid stuff recently for obvious reasons, and like in many types of adventure stories, all you have to do is vaguely allude to an evil empire, and everyone in the genre already has a lot of the backstory filled in for you. You don't have to go and explain why there's an evil empire, how there's an evil empire. Like, none of that needs to have, chapters and chapters of exposition does not need to happen.
And that works across multiple genres. That works in space opera, that works in high fantasy, that works in historical fiction, that works in so many different genres you can come up with. Just evil empire, boom, we got it. We know what you're talking about right there. Huge amount of explanation down into 2 words.
Yeah, and that itself is very useful to both the writer and the reader, because instead of having to go through chapters of exposition to establish this, there you go, you've already got it.
Right.
So the genre also serves a very, very useful communicative purpose.
And what it also does is, by doing it that way, when you're in a genre of that nature, it sets you up in a way where you can do your own thing in a new way, because that term evil empire has a lot of mental filled in for you already. So if you throw it out there and behave with it and just leave it vague for a few chapters, and then come in and throw in some detail that's, a detail to flesh it out, but that's very different from what they're expecting in their mental model, now you've given novelty but without actually breaking a genre trope. And
Mm.
you've provided that. So the actual in reality, when used well, those tropes can actually help you create the very novelty you're trying to get by
Yeah.
a little bit of misdirection and sleight of hand.
Yeah, well, and there's also, it's even possible, you can also just use the tropes very, very straight, and the novelty comes in for your backstory and explanation that justifies the trope in this case. Um,
Absolutely.
I mean, there's also just doing things really, really well. But like, you're familiar, I presume, with the mistaken identity premise of many comedy movies, especially like in
Hmm.
romantic comedies.
Oh
I've
yeah.
never seen this better done than in the Fred Astaire Ginger Rogers movie Top Hat. And the thing about this is most mistaken identity premises are not done all that well because there's always some absurd coincidences or just
Hmm.
stupid things where somebody's says like, "Hey, you person whose name I know, but I'm not saying for some reason," and you often have those things. Top Hat, by contrast, everything, everything was perfectly natural, made perfect sense through. Um, I mean, there's some over the top comedic characters, but actually, the mistaken identity was never depended on them being over the top. That was always humorous. Like it was just excellently executed. Where at every step of the way, the mistaken identity was completely natural, that it was not corrected. And so that in itself was, and now granted, this, I mean, it's almost sort of backwards because, the
Hmm.
1930s film was actually quite novel to me after seeing many things from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And then I saw this one, which happened to do it better than the rest of them anyway. But even if it came later, it would still be novel because of the ingenuity of the execution of it, that they really put together all of these circumstances that completely justified it.
Well,
And that's
and
how you do it also novel right there.
and the reality is that execution usually matters more than novelty anyway. Again, most readers really want something fairly familiar. Um, so, giving that to them, but then executing it very well usually works better than giving them something novel executed poorly.
Yeah.
Um, and, you know,
Well, and there's also
that's,
character too. Like the same basic story but with different characters, and
mhm,
then which gives the author a hell of a lot of work to do in figuring out how to manipulate the circumstances properly such that the most natural thing these unusual characters could do is come out the way they're supposed to in this
right.
sort of story.
Yeah.
Which itself requires a lot of novelty in the details to make a believable story with these new characters.
And again, it's all about the execution to make that happen. You have to pull it off well to do it. You have to get the details right.
Yeah,
Um,
which actually kind of interestingly brings us back, because one thing I found, I don't give, not many people have asked me for writing feedback, but where I have, I personally focus very, very intently on plot structure.
mhm.
That to me, the because plot has to flow out of characters. Like the plot has to come from the character doing the thing that their character would do in every circumstance, which
Right.
means that the way to accomplish this is to figure out, the way I like to approach things is figure out your fixed points in your story,
Mhm.
and then figure out what isn't fixed and how to adjust that such that everything actually fits together.
Right.
And so when I give writing feedback, I found it was very, very frustrating to the people to whom I did. I would approach that way, like asking, like, well, okay, so you want this, right? Well, there are only these like three different ways you can get this thing. So if this is the thing you definitely want, you kind of have to pick one of these three ways of making that happen.
Right.
So pick one of them, and then the way it works is going to be very, very natural. After once you've
Right.
made those decisions, like I don't want to make those decisions. Like, I don't think you're writing a
Then
story at this point. I mean,
what do you want to
yeah,
write?
probably different personality or something, but like this doesn't feel like you're actually writing a story because you're not deciding what's happening. It didn't make any sense
Well,
to me. But from that plot structure, um, and this actually brings us back to sort of where we started with the Christian
mhm.
universe. The nice thing is that the Christian universe gives you a whole bunch of fixed points that all work with each other,
Right.
and then the things that you vary are things that don't contradict it gives you those things that you can vary the things
Right.
over here that don't contradict them, and get a story where you can actually have characters making their own choices
It
that
does.
doesn't.
And it gives you a lot of fixed points, and one of the keys, like you already said, is it's a fixed bunch of fixed points that are already consistent. So there's a huge chunk of world building that's already done for you. Um, and one of the other things that I've found as a writer, and I think this is true for most people, um, the absolute worst time I have writing is when I have a blank sheet of paper and absolutely no constraints, when it's like I can sit down and write whatever I want right now. That's hard. That's really hard. But when I sit down and I have constraints, I'm like, this has to happen. This has to, it's this kind of story. I'm submitting it for this thing, and these are the requirements. The more constraints I put on the story, the easier it becomes for me to write it. Um,
It's a spurt of creativity.
it is a spurt of creativity. And,
Once you have an
you know,
actual problem, you can solve it.
one of the things that I'm finding is that the more that I write about this same set of characters, the easier it becomes, for multiple reasons. One, I'm starting to figure out, okay, in the ongoing series, here are the fixed points that I know I want to have happen. So now I have constraints to work within, but also these characters are already established. I know their personalities, so I put them in a certain situation, and I already know what they're going to do because I know their personalities. Um, the Christian worldview functions that way as well. Putting that theology on there and the mythology that goes with it. If I throw a certain kind of creature in there, um, I have a good sense of how that's going to work in this world. If I do a certain kind of thing, I know that that's going to work. There's things that will become major plot points over the course of the series that I already know simply because I chose that as a backdrop.
Mhm.
And it's like, okay, so these actions that I've taken in this book, these are the consequences that they're going to have in the long term because that's what this worldview dictates. For instance, in the book War Demons, I have one character who makes very heavy use of magic, in some not so good ways. And the Christian worldview on magic is that any kind of magic is automatically sinful and bad and corrupting, because magic is a contradiction of God's will and the natural order of the universe. So that's the Christian conception of it, is if you're participating in magic, you are automatically working against God's will, no matter what it is you're trying to do with it.
Because there's one source for magic within the Christian
Because
worldview.
there is one source for magic, and that's the devil. And it is, if it's not coming from the devil, it's not magic, it's miracle. Which comes from God. And there's a fundamental difference between those two things in the Christian worldview, which is that magic is me using it for my purposes and whatever I want to achieve, whereas miracle is using it for God's purpose and whatever he wants to achieve.
And moreover, submitting it to his wisdom.
And submitting it to his wisdom and to his will. And that's the fundamental reason in the Christian worldview why magic is wrong. Is this is not even wrong because it comes from the devil. It's wrong because it inherently is choosing to contradict God's will in the world.
It also has a second problem because miracle is asking God for something according to his wisdom, such that God will grant it in accordance with how things should happen to come out good. In magic, you're substituting your own wisdom, which is very limited.
Exactly.
And you don't foresee the consequences of what you're doing.
Yes.
And so it's going to come out badly because you can't see far enough into the future to actually choose well.
And so this worldview automatically dictates that this character who has been heavily involved in magic, he's going to have some bad consequences from it. And certain kinds of bad consequences. So it's like certain parts of the story almost write themselves after you insert these constraints on them. It's like, oh, well, this has to happen. This is just, it's what the world I've accepted and and decided to work with naturally dictates will happen in this kind of story. So that particular part doesn't happen so much on screen in this book, but it will be coming down the road later. So setting up to write the sequels, as I get into the outlines, it's like, oh, well, I know this has to happen. I know this
Yeah.
has to happen. I know has to say, okay, now I can work around those things to figure out what else I want to do to this book. But you get to a certain point, and a quarter of your outline has been written for you because of the constraints you put on it. So it's a very useful tool, and I don't have to spend hours upon hours upon hours building and constructing this worldview. Um, all I have to do is actually listen to catechism and pay attention to that. Um,
Yeah.
and so it sounds like a constraint, but in a way, it's actually very liberating because it frees me to focus on the parts of the story that are that come out of that, and to make it more interesting, which has
Yeah.
been a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, the fun thing, just a metaphor that occurred to me is a boat produces some very hard constraints, but it gives you the freedom to be
Right.
dry.
Right. And it gives you the freedom to move across the water. You're not just dry, you can actually move, and you can move far faster than you could if you jumped in and swam. And that's a large portion of, again, it's like building a framework. It's like, um, hey, I'm gonna grab this piece off the shelf and stick it into my project, and this huge piece of it is just done. And in this particular case, it's not just done, it's done very well, because this has been thought through very thoroughly for 2,000 years.
Yeah, the nails are actually inside the wood rather than sticking out of the cushions.
Right. And the details have really been poured over by people, by many people, some of whom are far far smarter than you and I, and so the answers are there, um,
Yeah,
and they come out very well.
there's only one way you get to tap into Plato, Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas,
Right.
and that's actually being in the tradition.
Exactly. And there's a lot that comes with it when you tap into those, and there's a huge framework, and it's very interesting. And I got a similar effect as well by choosing to set with an urban fantasy novel, by choosing to set it in the real world, in real places. You get some similar effects to that as well. And I actually even imposed a bigger constraint on myself by setting it in the past. um,
Mm.
it's not super far in the past, but it's set. The main character is a soldier who joins the army the day after September 11th because his fiance was killed
Mm.
in the attacks. Well, that puts time constraints on the story because he's sent home on a medical discharge 5 years later. Well, that dictates the time frame of the story. It's 5 years
Yeah.
later. That makes it 2006. Well, that puts he's in the real world in 2006. Well, a lot of real things happened there, that you have to work around.
Yeah.
Now, I have taken some constraints. There's things I've done in the story that I will be doing later on in the series because I don't really want it to be a political book.
Yeah.
So I will be, reacting to real events, but any of the politicians, and there will be some in the series, any of the in fact, the next book I'm already outlining is going to have several. There will be maybe some rough basing off of real politicians, but they won't be the real politicians because I don't want it to become a political book. That's not a territory I really want to get into with it.
Yeah.
Um,
There's an interesting rereading Pride and Prejudice. There's an interesting tradition I've seen in some of the older novels where there are certain things where they would mention real things where it'd be in the Shire militia.
right.
And so it was kind of fascinating. Like at first I was very frustrated, but like, what the heck? And then I thought, like, was this censored for some reason? Then I finally caught on to the fact that, like, instead of using a real name of someplace, we're just going to omit what the name is, showing you what sort of name it would be, but we're not going to pick one of them because we're just using a sort of, stand-in, which then removes the baggage, just like you're talking about not making a political thing. When the politician is Mr. Dash, this is not, a diatribe against a particular person. You don't have to either, you don't have to feel defensive if
Right.
you're on the wrong side. So I really, there's a long-standing tradition of doing that sort of thing.
Yeah. So there will be some modifications of that sort, but the major events, the history that happened at that point in time, I really want to leave them. And so, setting it just in the very recent past was a deliberate decision as well. It's not quite a period piece because it's not really long enough ago to be a period piece, but it's meant to put more constraints on the story that fulfill the same function. And that's worked out very well for me too, because that's given me a lot of framework. There are several events in the book that are not necessarily obvious in this book, but that will come back again by the time the series is done, where they tied into real events, and that formed a structure around which the story came.
There's one other interesting thing about setting stuff in the past. Well, there are many, but one interesting thing that occurs to me, something I thought about a lot, is that things that are in the past are in a sense safe, because things that are in
Right.
the present, we have no idea where we're headed. We could be headed someplace very good or someplace very bad. Things in the past, we know where they went, and therefore they're safe from that sort of worry.
That's right. And it gave a sense of, one of the tropes of the genre is basically to set it in the now, more or less. And it does give you that. It's like okay, I have all the things that have happened in the past. I don't know where things are going. But this is a case where you kind of know it is a safe zone. You know what happened then. People remember, the book's set in 2006. So, people more or less remember 2006, and it's close enough that we do remember it, and can remember where we were and what we were doing in those times. But it's also close enough that it's not a hugely different time, right?
But at the same time, we do know, for example, that at least for 10 years, nobody opened up a hellgate that swallowed the entire world.
Right.
So
the other thing,
constraints from the reader's perspective, like there's a certain safety in that sort of sense.
Right. And there's story consequences that are dictated as well. Like, he's a guy who just came home from the army in 2006. He's coming home from Afghanistan. Well, it's 2017 now, and we still have the U.S. Army in Afghanistan. So as the story progresses, I already know, looking several books ahead, this is a guy who's going to have friends who are still over there. As the story goes on, there's certain consequences of those decisions that carry over. And it provides a framework of things to draw on to help make the story happen. The other thing that it's safe from, in a way, is when you set a book now and the reading of the book is meant to feel like it's now, you can date yourself really badly.
Yes.
And we actually had this problem when we re-edited Declan Finn's A Pious Man, because there was a scene in the book, because he originally wrote it like 10 years ago and published it 8 years ago. So there's a scene in the book where somebody's pulling out like a pocket digital camera. And we were going through it, editing it, and we're like, well, when is this set? And we're like, well, originally it was set at about the time he wrote it, but now we're re-releasing it. Maybe it makes more sense to have it set now since it's a new release. So we're like, well, maybe that should be a smartphone instead of a digital camera, and so we kind of updated the text to go with that. And that's a pretty tame example. You could,
although it could be very problematic. Like if the person actually needed a cell phone,
it could become extremely problematic. And in this case it didn't, but it could. So by setting it in a defined time range, you avoid all of that problem. Somebody who comes back who's reading it, somebody's reading it now, they're already looking at it as this happened in the past. Somebody who reads it 10 years from now will still be looking at it as, oh, this happened in the past. So you automatically get in the mindset of whatever things were in the story there. If they felt wrong now, that's okay because it was written in 2006, or takes place in 2006, so that works.
Yeah, you get the
So
same thing. Period pieces are much harder to date than contemporary pieces, just like in movies. Like you take a
yes,
lot longer in a period piece to figure out when the heck was this movie made.
you usually do, especially if they were made past about 1980 when the film quality started to get really good.
Well, yeah,
And
there was
you
that
know
1970s Kodachrome
yeah,
color.
there's a up until a certain time point you can almost date a film by the visual look of it because of the film, and after that point they're all so good you can't use that as a reliable indicator anymore. And so yeah, anything after that point, the period pieces are much harder to date. And even before it, you're right, the period pieces, one good example, because we talked about watching it in the house recently and then we ended up not watching it, is the Ten Commandments by Charlton Heston.
Hmm.
Or well, not by him, but with him.
Yeah.
Sorry. Movie holds up extremely well. Decades after it was made, and it holds up extremely well. Why? Largely because it's a period piece. It's about ancient. It takes place in ancient Egypt, and it still looks like ancient Egypt. It doesn't hold up perfectly. There's parts like all the characters being played by white actors that in ancient Egypt that seems slightly out of place now, but most of
Yeah,
the rest of it holds up very well. And that's a lot of why is because it's a period piece. So
yeah, The Adventures of
you know,
Robin Hood starring Errol Flynn.
yeah, and so that was a conscious decision as well on my part with the book that I think turned out to be a very good one. That again was slightly breaking with the trope of urban fantasy, but that I think works well for the book and is going to be I think that most of the readers are going to be okay with that even within that genre. So
It also, I mean, without being familiar with the genre, so speaking with no authority of any kind, it also sounds though like because it's so recent that
right,
it is keeping with the spirit of setting them now.
yes, exactly, and that was intentional too. Is yeah, I'm going to keep it recent so that I don't have a huge problem with that. That was very intentional also. It was a conscious choice.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. But it's interesting as you're describing it. The Chesterton actually had a great line about how an artist loves his limitations because they define what he's doing.
Hmm.
The sculptor loves that the clay is colorless. The artist loves the painting that the canvas is square. And that if you break out of all limitations, you simply break out of doing art at all. Because art is inherently making choices within some constraint. Um, so it's an interesting, just taking what you're saying about the time period is an interesting metaphor also to the Christian universe,
Hmm.
in that both of them do produce some constraints, but in both cases they're things that worked out consistently, and
Right.
therefore your creativity is simply in different areas. But Chesterton again had a great metaphor of he was talking about dogma, but he used the metaphor of imagine children on a small island with a high precipice. That if there's a fence around the edge, they can run around playing very energetic games. But imagine someone decided to liberate them and took down the fence, and you came back sometime later, you would find the survivors huddled in the middle, very fearful of going anywhere near the edge for
Right.
fear of falling off. And so that's the thing about a definite framework, is it gives you guardrails that you can
Right.
then be as wild as you want inside the guardrails.
It does, and it's helpful. I found it very helpful for me to put constraints on it and to start working within those frameworks, and it made it much easier to write from there. And again, what I'm finding is that the deeper I get into the series, the easier it becomes, even still, to keep writing because the framework is already built and it's already there, and so much is already laid down that it's just okay, this can only really go so many ways, and it's just a matter of picking one of them rather than dreaming something up out of nothing.
Mm.
And
Also, I guess one of the benefits of trying to write a good story rather than trying to scandalize your grandparents. I mean, it's a funny thing, but it's
Yeah.
amazing how many bad stories are written by very, very broken people who were either trying to put themselves through therapy by writing it, or were clearly trying to scandalize their parents, grandparents, or stand-ins thereof.
It is, and I think we have this modern conception that I don't really know where we're taught it, but we have this modern belief that good art comes from people who are broken, and I don't actually think that's largely true. I think that we have cases of it. There's certainly cases like Van Gogh and others where people are deeply disturbed, and we get good art out of it, but I think there are so many other cases where no, I mean, a lot of good stuff actually comes from people who are quite well adjusted. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, no, very, very much so. To a great degree. I actually think, I mean, for one thing, I think a lot of this is actually a fictional trope itself, because a lot of people like to write about broken people, and a lot of people like to write about what they know, and people who are writers know about writing. And so
right.
if you kind of throw those three things together, it makes for a certain type of trope. Another thing, though, is the viewing of actors as artists, and a lot of actors are very broken people. There are plenty of
Some of
very
them are.
healthy people who are actors too, but there's something very unique in the actor, and since the actor's acting out somebody else's words, the very broken. I'm sorry. Since an actor is acting out other people's words in very, very short snippets,
Mhm.
where they get many, many takes and someone picks the best take, very broken people are capable of doing a good job under those conditions.
There's that. There's also a fact, in my opinion, acting is. Sorry if this is offensive to some people, but I have a very strong opinion actually that acting is a career that makes people broken.
Mm,
Um, and there's several reasons for that. One is your entire career is about pretending to be somebody else, and that's not actually a very healthy activity.
mm,
Um, especially the more extreme that becomes, the more unhealthy it is. So you see some of these people who get seriously into method acting to play
mm.
very strange parts, and you watch them, and most of them come out of it somewhat scarred.
Yeah,
But also, the human brain is a very strange machine in the way that it works, and I don't know if you've ever done this. You're a fairly honest person, so you may not have ever been through this exercise, but the best way to tell a lie is to convince yourself that it's true.
mm,
And the best way to convince yourself that something is true is to repeat it over and over again. Um, and I can also tell you, hold that thought for a minute. We'll come back to it. As a martial arts instructor, I can tell you that the way to train a body part to do a motion is to do it over and over again. Um, your mental state and your emotions are the same way. I've done this on myself. I was not a very happy person in my teens and in my early 20s. I was a fairly depressed person most of the time. I'm a very happy person now. How did I get that way? Mostly by pretending to be happy until I actually became happy.
mm.
You
I
know,
remember you mentioned in a
I
previous
went, I
conversation.
went through the motions, and after a while, you go through the motions until it becomes reality. Um, so here's the problem when you're acting. You start acting out all these emotions all the time that aren't your real emotions. What happens? Your body adopts them
Mm,
as your real emotions. It's how our brains work. We're wired that way to do that.
yeah.
So you're training your body by being an actor. You're training your mind to be something that's not what you are. And then you are doing that in multiple ways. You're going from part to part where you're training your body and your mind to be different people.
Mm,
I think it's a process that fundamentally breaks down the human mind. As a very specific example of it, um, how many times have you heard the story? Big name actor A who's married starts working on a set in a romantic role with big name actress B, who is also married. And by the end of the film, they're both divorced and seeing each other. What happens? You put two human beings in close proximity in a physically intimate sense, and the natural reaction is for them to start to actually develop real attraction to each other and real feelings for each other. This is why arranged marriages actually work so much of the time. You put people together who don't have a romantic attachment, but they start acting that way towards each other, and eventually it takes.
They pair bond, yeah.
They pair
Yeah.
bond. So you go through this process as an actor, and you see this happen so many times. It's the nature of the job. It breaks down the human psyche and reprograms it with
Mm.
other behaviors, and it leads to these kinds of results. So I'm of the opinion that it's not so much that broken people become good actors as that good actors become broken people.
Mm.
And,
There may be a lot to that. I was just advancing that acting is one of the rarer forms of art that has no particular impediment to broken people.
I
That
agree with that as well. I don't
it
think
doesn't
you're
filter the
wrong.
broken people out. I mean, and actually, as sort of there's in a selective pressure for who the heck would sign up for that sort of job?
Well, exactly. And I've had this discussion with my wife because she was big into acting in high school. And before we got married, she was seriously considering going into that career. And both of us now, much older and wiser, are very, very, very glad that she didn't.
Oh yeah,
Largely for precisely the reasons we've just talked about. We're like, this would have been terrible. And had you done this, not because I was supportive at the time. I was like, okay, yeah, we'll see what we can do to help make this happen. But looking back on it, I'm like, despite that, or maybe even because I was supportive of it, odds are really high our marriage wouldn't have survived it.
yeah,
Um, because most of them don't, and you see that it's a community. Even small communities of actors there tend to be very much a bunch of dysfunctional relationships. Uh,
yeah. There's an interesting interview I saw with John Rhys Davies, who's one of those rare. I think it's John Rhys Davies, one of those rare actors who actually has been married to the same person for decades, and
right.
Um, and interestingly, he was talking about how, in his view, one of the big problems that movie actors have is that on a movie shoot, you've got virtually nothing to do as an actor.
Right.
And a lot of people get into trouble with how they fill their time. And
Mm-hmm.
his solution was with every movie he would do, he would take up a new hobby. And so for the 99% of the time he was not working on the movie because, every now and then you actually have to go and do something, but most of the time you've got nothing to do. He would not hang out with the other actors. He would hang out with the people as his job. He would go and work on learning this hobby. So it'd be sailboating this time, painting that time, sculpting another time, carpentry another
Mm-hmm.
time, whatever. Every time it'd be a new hobby. So it's something new, something interesting to be doing, something you could put loads and loads of time into as you've got almost nothing to do. And so he found that this kept him vastly saner. I mean, actually, I think interestingly, it ties in too to what you're saying because he would spend almost his entire time being himself,
Right.
doing some real human activity, and so the being somebody else would be a just small little interlude on a few days here and there.
I can see that very well. It strikes me as a very good plan under the circumstances, for the reasons that he explained and also the ones that I've said together. Um, it strikes me as a good way to handle it. Um, it's a you know it's the way that it is. And
Yeah,
as a side note, through most of human history, actors have not been viewed as a very high status profession, and a lot of it's for precisely those reasons.
yeah. Well, actually, there's a fascinating part in De Civitate Dei. I don't know why I use the Latin title because I'm reading the thing in English because I don't read Latin. But yeah, but in the City of God, he talks about actors and the different approaches the Greek and Romans. Now, one of the extra problems was that actors did things that no respectable person should be doing. because they
And they still
depicted
do today.
well, yeah, and they depicted they would depict the terrible things the gods did,
Mm-hmm.
and cheating on wives and other stuff that no one should do. And you're going up on stage in front of people and representing this reprehensible behavior. And so there's an interesting thing where he said the Romans despise actors, whereas the Greeks respect them because the gods demand that they put on these plays. And so because the gods demand that you put on these plays, it has to be a respectable thing to actually go and fulfill the demands of the gods, which has to be done. And so he said, to the greater credit of the Romans and consistency of the Greeks, they have this divergency in how they treat actors.
That's amusing. It also fits very well with both cultures. It's intriguing from that perspective. I hadn't ever heard that before.
Yeah, it's only like one of the chapters or a few chapters where he talks about actors, and because he's talking about like how ridiculous it is. Like, you guys are worshiping these guys, and they're the worst among you. Is the basic overarching.
And it's funny because it jives so well with American culture, because we worship actors mostly because we worship money, and they have lots of it. So we're like, oh, hey.
One of the astonishing things, because we both have a 7-year-old, right? You have a 7-year-old as well?
I do, yes. My oldest is 7.
Yeah, has he ever seen anything on YouTube? Or any shows like Arrested Development or anything like that?
He has not seen Arrested Development. He's seen YouTube, but mostly only Minecraft videos on YouTube.
Yeah, well, mine has also seen primarily Minecraft and Five Nights at Freddy's stuff. But actually, the both of them, but mostly Minecraft. The thing is, and something I first had to do this with, and for those watching, it's not primarily about children, but it was Arrested Development, and that's one of those shows where everybody's horribly broken. All the characters are horribly broken.
Yeah,
and this is what
broken.
When he was like 4 or 5. My wife was watching, and I'm not nearly so fond of the show, and he came in, and I was like, this is not good. But I saw him like imitating something, and I actually explained to him. He's 5, I think, and I explained, this is people pretending to do stuff. And they're pretending to do this because these are things you should never, ever, ever do. And so it's kind of funny when somebody does it, but it's only okay because everyone's pretending. And he actually understood that concept and stopped trying to imitate it. And I recently discovered I had to do the same thing for like Let's Play Minecraft videos, because a lot of people are jerks to each other for laughs.
Right.
Because they are doing things like, stabbing each other in the back in a literal but in video game sense, and other things which are really, really mean and unpleasant. And I had to explain to him, like the previous thing, this is people who are doing this by agreement because they think it's going to be entertaining, because they're old enough to know you never ever do this stuff, because if you actually do this to any of your friends, they'll cease to be your friends pretty quickly. And
I think I may actually have to have this talk with my son about some of the Minecraft stuff here.
Yeah, it was the Minecraft ones, like Pat and Jen, popular MMOs, which are one of the most popular. They're actually pretty good to each other, from what I've seen. They're married, and they tend to treat each other fairly well. The ones that are all guys, a lot of them are, for one thing, everyone screams for some reason, and for another, a lot of them are really, really just dicks to each other, and so I've had to explain this, because like he tries playing Minecraft with his 4-year-old brother, and I've caught him on occasion trying to imitate this. And at one point he was talking about, like, well, when my little brother's a little older and then he enjoys being pranked, and I had to explain, no one enjoys being pranked. That's not a thing. And then it was funny because he was crying, saying like, YouTube's so mean that they're tricking us. And I had to explain, no, it's that these people are much older than you. And so they've already learned these rules so well, they don't question them at all. And so they kind of assume that everybody watching also knows that you never, ever do this. And that's why everyone thinks it's funny. I may have, some of these people, I'm not sure, I may have been being a little overly generous here.
Yeah.
But that said...
but it's the right framework for him to be watching this.
It is. Some of these
those
people,
days.
that's true. And some of these people, I'm being overly generous, and
Yeah.
actually, these are just people you shouldn't associate with. Um, but you give them the benefit of the doubt. Um, in itself is good. And as you said, it's the right framework. Um, and so this itself is one of the really curious things when we get back to the damage and the damaged art. Um, there's the really curious sort of thing where it's hard to tell the difference because sometimes people will violate things because it's funny because you take so thoroughly for granted that you would never do anything wrong like this that it's funny to even portray doing it.
Hmm.
And then other people just like the shock value of getting away with it, or
Right.
not even shock value, but just some context in which they can get away with doing the things they can't get away with in real life.
Hmm.
And so there's you see both, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between them. But bring it back to the damaged people doing art. That I think there has been some confusion between those two things. That the like Peter Kreeft told a story. Is telling his conversion story. Fascinating thing, by the way. I recommend watching if you can find it. It's a little
Hmm.
long, but his conversion story to Catholicism. He's a professor, a philosophy professor, very interesting guy. Um, and but anyhow, and he mentioned something that was in anti-Catholic literature that because he grew up Calvinist of some kind. And so in some anti-Catholic literature, as he was starting to get interested in the church, some anti-Catholic literature that Calvinist friends of his gave him to try to dissuade him. One of them included some bawdy anti-Catholic jokes um, from they actually date more from like the Middle Ages. It wasn't quite anti-Catholic at the time. It was just someone who liked to collect sort of stories.
Hmm.
Um, and saying it really quickly, there's a bishop and a Jew who are friends, and then the Jewish merchant said he had to go conduct some business in Rome, and the bishop was saying like, look, I kind of get the sense that you're interested in becoming Christian. Why don't you get baptized before you go there? Because things aren't real clear in Rome. This is during the time of the Borgia popes, the really, really horrible people for those watching. And anyway, I said, no, I'm personal rule, business before pleasure. If I get baptized, it's a pleasure, so I'll go conduct my business first. And he went off a few months later, and Bishop figured, okay, I've lost him. Came back a few months later and said, okay, I'm ready to be baptized. And, oh, you didn't go down there? No, I did. You didn't conduct business at the Vatican? No, I did. And you still want to be baptized? He said, look, I don't really understand theology. That's your thing. It's interesting, but I don't get it nearly as well as you do. But I get business. And if I conducted my business as badly as they do down there, I'd be out of business in 3 weeks. Let alone, I'd be out of business in 10 weeks, let alone 1,000 years. It's a miracle. I'm convinced. And then Peter Kreeft said, and the thing is, this is actually a legitimate argument.
Yeah.
It's not just funny; it's actually a legitimate argument in favor of the church. And that's the thing. Like somebody like a Peter Kreeft, who he does apologetics. He's philosophy professor. He's a devout Catholic. For the last many decades. He can tell that sort of story, and it's funny, and it's the sort of thing that even Catholics will find funny. Catholics,
Hmm.
believing Catholics will find funny. A lot of people who don't understand it, though, can only conceive of that sort of thing in general as something done by people, from a place of hatred, people who are
Right.
very damaged and don't understand it. And so I think one place that idea of that tormented artist comes from is a misunderstanding of where more subtle things have come from.
Hmm.
And because of course there are two ways of being hard to understand. One is by being so very complex so that it's hard to understand, and the other is by being raving nonsense. And
Right.
it's a lot easier to make raving nonsense than sublime things. And so I think there's some element in which people who couldn't tell the difference could see the output, the raving nonsense, mistake it for something sublime, and associate the raving nonsense with the damaged people and see plenty of them. And so somewhat infer, because the sublime stuff is few and far between, that they must have been damaged too.
Right. The thing that immediately pops into my head is Vox Day's paraphrasing of the famous Arthur C. Clarke quote. Any sufficiently advanced intelligence is indistinguishable from insanity. And there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, if somebody's operating at a level that's so far above your intelligence that you can't understand it, it does look an awful lot like insanity. And art can look that way. If somebody's operating art at a level where you don't understand what they're actually doing, it can look just crazy or broken. Or it could just be raving nonsense.
Yeah. Which, I mean, modern art in the visual arts has demonstrated, when people can't tell the difference, piles
Right.
of elephant dung,
Right.
random things. I saw someone on Twitter recently mention that at this point he figures that modern art is just a money laundering scheme. Which I actually is one of the plot points in a story I've yet to write about. It came up with beforehand, about how an assassin launders his money. In fact, that there's the first step is you hire to hire the assassin. You hire this consulting firm, because no one can measure the output of a consulting firm, and that consulting firm happens to be run by somebody who has great taste in the artist who happens to be the assassin, and so that's the way they launder the money through. Because the squiggles that you characteristically happen to throw, as you throw the paint can against the canvas, no one can tell these days that that's not art. So the fact that you got $100,000 for it,
right,
no one can question.
Yeah, and that's a yeah, I think that's a fair point. Is that one of the ways I think you can tell with modern art is that some of it is literally just poop. If that's your art, I'm gonna go with raving lunacy rather than sufficiently high intelligence on that one.
Yeah, there's a great story about. Do you guys see the one about? There's an exhibit that was like, it was depicting like the aftermath of a party or something like that, and a new janitor didn't realize this was an art installation and cleaned it up, because it looked exactly like the aftermath of, like, there was a reception or party here or something, and people didn't clean up after themselves.
Yeah, poor guy's just doing his job.
Well, yeah, exactly. Like, I think he didn't get in trouble, but yeah, exactly that. He's going through and, like, here's a bunch of garbage on the floor, so he swept it up and put it in the garbage. And yeah, it's a perfect metaphor for that. Now, novels on the plus side aren't put up on the wall to show off to people nearly as much. They tend to be read a little bit more. So it's never gotten quite that bad. Although that review I saw once of the sci-fi story where there are these bio ships where women give birth to ship parts. And so there's this like matriarchy, and the review of this thing was talking about how this thing is incredibly painful to read. They actually use the phrase "goes down like a jagged little pill" as I believe a positive in the review. So some things are trending in that direction, but that said, and to wrap it up, because we should probably both get going, probably a good note to end on is that, and it's something that I've seen, since my biggest interest probably is apologetics. And something I've really been thinking about, because argumentation works with a few people and not many. And if you look at what Jesus did in the Gospels, he argued with very, very few people. What he did is he simply told people the truth, and then those who can accept it would. And right. It's not quite 100%, but it's really, really, really common that he would give people the truth, and whoever would hear it. And I think that's, there is in that a good lesson too for people who want to write good stories, that there's the element of trying to change the culture, trying to fix art, or trying to figure out why people like broken art so much. But there's also just writing good stories and letting the people who enjoy them find them.
Right. And the view that I've always had from the day that I started writing is you can't write a book that's for everybody. You cannot write a book that will make everybody happy, that everybody will want to read. You can't even make a book that everybody in the subset of people who actually read books will want to read. Um, Pull any book that you love, any book that's a classic, any book that's genuinely loved by many people, and you'll find a handful of terrible reviews. The example that I use, is that there's even a few bozos out there who don't love the Lord of the Rings. Um, Not to pick on our host too much, but other examples. I mean, there's people out there who don't love Shakespeare. There's people out there who don't love Dumas. There's people out there who don't love Dickens. Hand raised. I'm not a Dickens fan. Any particular huge name author. There's people who don't like J.K. Rowling, the richest woman in Britain, from the books she's written that have sold so much. You can't make everybody happy. So, write a good story, write a story that you stand behind, and realize that you're not going to make everybody happy. And if you want to be commercially successful at it, find the people who will like it and get it to them. The approach that we've been talking about through this whole interview of taking that Christian backdrop for granted. I knew from the moment I chose to do that, I knew there's an audience I'd lose because of that simple decision. There's an audience out there who won't even read it now that they've heard me say that. They've automatically dismissed it out of hand. That's fine. That's not the people I'm writing for. There's another group out there that is going to go pick that book up specifically because they've heard that about it. And they'll say, hey, that sounds really interesting. Cool. I'm writing for those people. But the other group I'm writing for is the people who are like, okay, I'll give that a shot. And then they can go judge me and find out if the story's any good or not. My goal is to do the job well enough that that group of people will come in and say, well, that's not the choice I would have made, but hey, it was a good book and I liked it. So if I get to that point, then I'm happy with the decision. And, for the folks who look at it as a positive, great. I'd love to have you guys on board too and go from there. So, I think there's a sufficiently large group of both people that the book will find an audience. So, you're going to, but any decision you make when writing is going to have that exact effect. So don't be afraid to make the decision and make a good story, and just be ready to accept the handful of bad reviews you're going to get along the way and move on.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for talking with me. It's been quite a pleasure as always.
It's been fun.
Yeah. Good luck. I hope the book does really well.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, Chris. I really appreciate it.